Hey guys, tonight we'll drift into the quiet resilience and remarkable endurance of the folks who lived not in castles or noble halls, but in the damp, drafty corners of the medieval countryside peasants who faced each bitter winter night not with luxury but with sheer willpower. These were not the knights or lords of storybooks, but the real backbone of the era who somehow managed to keep breathing through the longest, coldest months of the year. From stuffing animal skins into wall gaps to clustering together like chilled sardines, their world was a masterpiece of make-do survival. So before we settle into this evening's slow unraveling tale, feel free to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you actually find this kind of sleepy storytelling worthwhile. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time the clock says on your end. It's always curious to see who's listening in from across the globe. Now, lower the lights, maybe switch on a quiet fan to hum in the background, and let's gently sink into the worn, straw-stuffed lives of medieval winter. When someone says medieval, your mind might jump to gallant tournaments, overflowing banquets, and the gleeful chaos of market day. But for your average plow pusher, winter was less about joy and more about surviving until breakfast. It wasn't a festive season so much as an annual exam of pain tolerance administered by the cold itself. A relentless teacher who didn't believe in makeup tests. Imagine this. Your entire home is smaller than a modern garage, built of twigs and mud, with walls so thin you could hear a fox sneeze 3 houses over. There's no insulation, not even a real window, unless you count the small slit plugged with pigskin, and certainly no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside of your dwelling might be 1 or 2 shy degrees above the wind chill outside, which means if it's freezing out there, it's only fractionally less freezing right where you sleep. Nights were pure misery. Pitch black, with the wind screaming through every crevice like an angry ghost that couldn't find rest, and your hearth fire flickering in its corner like a dying candle, just barely managing to toast the toes of whoever huddled nearest. If you were seated more than a few feet from the flames, well, you might as well be camped out under the stars. Minus the charm, and with significantly worse snacks, warm clothing, that was a fantasy. There were no luxury furs or down-filled blankets for the working poor, just coarse wool garments that felt like wearing damp carpet. A goat-smelling cloak you clung to for dear life, and a prayer that layering yourself like a human cabbage might help fend off frostbite. Spoiler, it didn't. Don't even think about cozy quilts. Beds were typically nothing more than a straw-filled sack tossed in a corner, layered with maybe a few weeds for ambience, and garnished with a generous helping of fleas. Welcome to medieval 5-star sleeping. The chill wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Frostbite lurked in the corners, waiting for bare skin. Hypothermia was a regular guest. Children and older folks were especially at risk, and waking up alive was often considered a small miracle, worthy of celebration. Perhaps with a breakfast turnip that was only slightly frozen. Surviving the cold months wasn't about finding comfort, it was about sheer tenacity, piling on every wool scrap you owned, curling up next to a goat or a pig, and hoping you didn't turn into a human icicle by dawn. And that was only the start of the struggle. If you think your drafty apartment is a hardship, peasants would kindly like you to shut it. Their homes weren't drafty. They were practically enthusiastic wind tunnels, barely keeping the outside from becoming the inside. Most peasant cottages were built using what historians politely call wattle and daub, which translates to crisscross twigs plastered over with a delightful paste of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Not for laughs, it actually helped hold things together. And, well, there was always more of it available. These walls, regardless of how lovingly smeared, were no match for an honest snowstorm. The wind had a knack for finding even the tiniest hole and dancing in with wild abandon, turning one-room homes into windswept arenas where warmth was more a memory than a state of being. Privacy didn't exist. Warmth barely counted. But character, oh, that was built daily. The roofs, thatched and picturesque on postcards, sure, but after a few weeks of heavy weather, they sagged like tired old backs, leaked steadily, and often became unintended landing pads for rats, birds, and the occasional, overly confident squirrel. Windows, if they existed at all, were minuscule slits covered with whatever could be spared, thin bits of animal hide, or shutters carved from warped wood. Glass was so rare and expensive that even the local lord might have owned only a single small pane, proudly displayed like a jewel. For peasants, glass was an unimaginable luxury. They'd count themselves lucky if a stray gust didn't rip the hide from the frame mid-blizzard. The floor didn't help either. Most homes had no actual flooring, just the beaten-down earth, compacted into reluctant submission. During heavy rain or snowfall, that dirt turned back into mud, creeping upward through the room until your living space felt less like a house and more like a swamp that owed you rent. Cold from the ground, cold from the roof, cold squeezing in from the walls, it was like being under attack from all directions, every hour of the day. But peasants weren't quitters. They crammed moss into cracks, shoved rags into the worst holes, and nestled themselves together in heaps, using each other as the last barrier between survival and frost. Where there wasn't insulation, they created it with determination and, occasionally, sheep fat rubbed along the wall. If your house was crumbling and your best weapon against winter involved mud and goat hair, you made it workhand. Maybe, just maybe, you found a way to laugh about it if your lips weren't frozen shut. But the real enemy didn't only howl from the sky or scream through the windows. Iltsit also rose silently from below. Now, you might imagine that once a medieval peasant had successfully fended off the biting winds howling in from the walls and roof, things would start to improve. But you'd be wrong. Because beneath the cracked soles of their frost-numbed feet lurked another silent nemesis. The ground itself, that's right, the floor, if you could call it that, was more of an accessory to misery than a foundation for warmth. Most peasant homes didn't have what we'd consider a floor at all. There were no wooden planks, no tile mosaics, and certainly no soft rugs, unless you counted a discarded sack or a flattened animal pelt riddled with lice. No, the vast majority of cottages sat directly on cold, compacted earth ground that drank in rain, seeped in snowmelt, and gleefully returned it upward in the form of clammy mud that squelched between your toes like nature's own insult. Imagine waking up before sunrise, your body already half frozen from the air around you, only to swing your legs over the side of your straw-filled sack and plant your feet directly into a cold, damp patch of soil. That is, if your foot didn't land on a startled mouse or a beetle the size of your thumb. The dampness clung to everything. It crept into your blankets, your boots, if you were lucky enough to own a pair, and your bones. Every joint ached with it. Every breath in that dirt room was thick with a kind of earthiness that no candle or fire could burn away. Speaking of fire, that was the next daily gamble. Heating was a fragile affair. If your family had a hearth, congratulations, you were among the luckier ones. Many homes relied on a small pit in the center of the room, a place where smoky flames licked upward, barely lighting the gloom and mostly making the air just breathable enough to not immediately pass out. Chimneys were rare. Instead, smoke from burning peat or damp would fill the interior and slowly drifted upward, if the wind allowed. In winter, the choice was brutal. Breathe smoke and stay warm, or have fresh air and freeze. Most chose the smoke, better a coughing fit than frostbite. Ceilings blackened with soot. Children grew up with a hacking cough by the age of 5. But the smoke had one unintended benefit: it helped preserve the wooden beams above and kept bugs at bay. So perhaps wheezing through the long nights wasn't just tolerated, but even a kind of protection. The fire, small and flickering, was rarely allowed to go out. It was your lifeline. Keeping it alive meant less shivering and more chances of not dying before spring. But wood was scarce. You didn't just chop down trees. That was often forbidden, as the forests were controlled by landowners. So peasants gathered what they could: twigs, dried animal dung, bundles of straw. Cowpats were dried in the sun and stacked like miserable pancakes, each one a potential fuel source when the temperature dipped below comfort and into "will we live through this" range. The smell of burning dung, by the way, is not one you forget. Imagine the aroma of a stable mixed with a hint of roasted despair. But when it was the only thing between your fingers and frostbite, you lit that cowpat with pride. Still, for many, even finding enough fuel was a daily challenge. If your fire went out overnight, and it often did. You had to borrow a burning ember from a neighbor. That meant trudging through the snow or slush with a clay pot, hoping to God the ember didn't die on the way home. It was a ritual so common, it had a name in several dialects. A cold morning often started not with breakfast, but with a fire sprint. Speaking of breakfast, you might be wondering what was on the medieval winter menu. Spoiler alert, not much. By December, most of the autumn harvest had been rationed into tight bundles of grain, dried legumes, and root vegetables that looked like they'd lost all will to live. If you had salted pork, congratulations, you were either a pig thief or incredibly lucky. Most meals involved gruel, a thin paste made from oats or barley, boiled with water, and maybe a splash of sour milk if you were feeling luxurious. Gruel was a warm hug for the stomach, assuming that hug came from a damp sock. Sometimes there was black bread, made from rye or whatever flour you could scavenge. It was dense, slightly sour, and so tough it doubled as a weapon in self-defense. Protein was a privilege. Eggs were rare in winter chickens, laid fewer in the cold, and milk often froze before you could bring it indoors. And if the cow died from cold, that was it. No second chance. For most peasants, starvation wasn't a distant risk. It was an unwelcome visitor that dropped by every January. Children often shrank from one winter to the next. Adults grew thinner, their skin dulling and tightening across cheekbones like parchment stretched over old driftwood. The hunger didn't just gnaw at the belly, it crept into the mind. People became irritable, withdrawn, resigned. In some parts of Europe, there were whispers of families resorting to bark brothias, boiling tree bark, or eating leather from old shoes. And that was considered resourceful. But the most insidious enemy of all was not the cold, or the damp, or even the hunger. It was the dark. Winter nights in medieval villages weren't just long, they were oppressively endless. With daylight often lasting less than 8 hours, entire families were swallowed by the gloom. After sunset, there was nothing to do, no books to read, no radio to hum from a corner, no artificial light to chase shadows from the rafters. You sat in near blackness, your fire casting a weak orange glow that made faces look like half-formed ghosts. People went to bed early, not because they were well rested, but because there was nothing else to do, and the cold was easier to ignore, if you didn't have to be awake for it. Some families slept in shifts, taking turns tending the fire. Others bundled together in a single bed, stacked like spoons, children wedged between adults like insulation. Privacy wasn't a concept. If someone snored or had gas, that was your lullaby. If a baby cried, everyone heard it. And if an old relative passed away in the night, you didn't always realize until morning. In the dark, time stretched. Sleep was often broken. People would wake up in the middle of the night, not sure if it was 1 a.m. or 5. Historians call it segmented sleep, 2 chunks of rest broken by a twilight waking where people sometimes prayed, talked, or just stared at the ceiling, hoping a rat wouldn't fall on their face. The brain, deprived of light and stimulation, entered strange rhythms. People dreamed more vividly. Some even claimed to have visions. It wasn't mystical, it was neural. But when you live in a mud hut, with no light, barely enough to eat, and only the warmth of your cousin's elbow to keep you alive, hallucinations seem entirely reasonable. Still, they endured. That's the part modern minds forget. These people didn't have options, yet they endured. Day after day, night after night, cold, damp, shivering, hungry, bored, terrified, and completely at the mercy of a world that barely noticed if they vanished. And yet when the thaw came, when spring returned and the mud gave way to shoots of green, they stepped out again, barefoot, calloused, grinning, and alive. And they got to work. Because surviving winter wasn't the end of suffering. It was just the beginning of planting season. Now, if you're thinking that once spring finally arrived, life for the medieval peasant turned into some kind of flower-filled fairy tale, I regret to inform you that nature had other plans. Because while the snow melted and the birds returned, and the fields began to green, those same fields had to be worked by the exact same people who had just spent the entire winter trying not to freeze to death. And unlike modern calendars with their bank holidays and PTO requests, medieval time didn't offer a break between survival and labor. There was no gentle onboarding process. No, spring came in like a hammer, and the first thing it crushed was your spine. The soil, still damp from the thaw, had to be plowed, tilled, and seeded by hand, by oxen, if you were lucky, and by aching backs that hadn't known a proper mattress in generations. And let's talk about those tools for a moment. You might be picturing something forged in a quaint blacksmith's shop, shiny and ready to get the job done. Try instead a wooden plow held together with rope, repaired 17 times, dragged behind an animal that resented you almost as much as you resented it. The average peasant wasn't working with sleek iron blades or ergonomic handles. They were hacking at the earth with splintering sticks and rusted metal bits, many of which had been passed down since the reign of a king no one remembered. Digging in the mud with these relics was less like gardening and more like losing a fight to a damp field. And you had to do it quickly before the rains came, before the weeds took over, before the lord of the manor showed up demanding his share of what hadn't even grown yet. You see, medieval farming wasn't just about growing food. It was about obligation. Because the land you worked didn't belong to you. It belonged to someone higher up, a noble, a monastery, a crown, and they expected payment, not in coins, because you likely didn't have any, but in produce. You grew barley. They took half, raised chickens, say goodbye to the eggs, had a bumper crop of turnips. The tax collector was already drooling, and heaven help you if you couldn't. Pay debts rolled over. Penalties increased. Your ox might be seized, or worse, your daughter might be offered up to work in the manor kitchen, where she'd spend the next 20 years peeling onions and trying not to look anyone in the eye. The spring season wasn't about renewal, it was about racing against the calendar of suffering. And speaking of racing, let's not forget the livestock. Medieval animals had all the charm of a bar fight, and none of the predictability. Pigs escaped constantly. Chickens refused to lay. Sheep wandered into bogs and had to be fished out with ropes. And if you had a cow, you'd better hope it didn't die. Because veterinary medicine at the time was less science and more chanting, while rubbing herbs on the udder. Most peasants knew their animals better than they knew their own neighbors. And that's because these animals were not just companions, they were survival machines. Every beast had to be fed, watered, and protected. Wolves and foxes didn't. Take seasonal holidays. In fact, spring was when predators came back with hungry cubs and extra motivation. So while you were digging, planting, and paying taxes, you were also keeping watch for glowing eyes at the edge of the woods, and that wasn't your only worry. Spring was when the diseases came back. After a winter of close quarters, minimal hygiene, and weak immune systems, all it took was one sneeze from a sick child to spread fever through the entire village. There were no antibiotics, no thermometers, and no understanding of germ theory. Illness was explained by miasmas, bad spirits, or God being particularly disappointed in your turnip harvest. A cough could mean death. A boil might mean plague. And if someone did die, well, that was a logistical problem. You see, after a harsh winter, grave digging became a community event. The ground might still be partially frozen. The graveyard could already be full. Sometimes people were buried in shallow plots, wrapped in whatever cloth was available, marked only by a hastily carved wooden post that would rot before the next planting season. But despite all of this, life didn't stop. It couldn't. Peasants, still married, still had children, still told stories by the fire stories about ghosts in the forest. Saints who wept milk, and fair-off kings who lived in castles made of cheese. These tales weren't just distractions, they were fuel. They gave people something to laugh about, something to believe in. Because when your hands are blistered, and your feet are cracked, and you haven't seen a piece of fruit in 6 months, a good ghost story can feel like a feast. And then there were the festivals. Once in a while, the church calendar offered a reprieve in the form of a holy day. These were technically religious events, but for the average peasant, they were better. Known as the days you didn't have to work until your fingers bled, people would dress up, drink heavily, and try to pretend for just one day that their lives weren't completely ruled by dirt, debt, and diarrhea. There'd be dancing, music, games, and occasionally a man on stilts pretending to be a biblical prophet. Children would chase each other with sticks. Old women would sell herbs they swore could cure anything. And if you were lucky, someone might roast a pig. It was glorious. It was temporary. And then the next morning, the Lord Steward would ride through the village on a tired horse, holding a scroll of parchment that listed everything you owed and everything you hadn't yet given. Spring, in short, was not a season of rebirth. It was the season where the world reminded you that while you might have survived the winter, you weren't done suffering yet. The mud was different, yes. It was warmer now, and it squelched with a hopeful kind of arrogance. But it still pulled at your boots and stole your energy. The sun might rise earlier, but that just meant you started working sooner. The birds might sing, but only loud enough to drown out the creaking of your spine as you lifted another sack of barley, and as you wiped the sweat from your brow, already sticky with mid-March pollen. You'd look up at the hills and see the castle on the horizon, the stone home of the man who owned everything you touched, and you'd sigh and get back to work, because no one ever rebelled in spring. Spring was for submission. Summer was for hope. Autumn was for fear. And winter, well, we already covered that. But it's important to understand that the medieval year wasn't divided by solstices or holidays. It was divided by pain. And pain, like the taxes, always came right on time. Now, since we've trudged through the mud and misery of spring, it's only fair we turn our gaze to summer, which you might imagine brought some long-awaited relief, warm days, longer light, and perhaps even a bit of happiness. But no, this is medieval Europe, not a wellness retreat. In this chapter of our ongoing saga of survival, summer didn't mean barbecues and lemonade. Summer meant heatstroke, crop failure, and the world's most exhausting unpaid internship, being a serf. Because now that the fields were planted and the threat of frost was behind you, it was time to weed, water, chase off birds, fix the fences, shear the sheep, haul water from the stream every morning before sunrise, and then try to explain to your local priest why the saints weren't answering prayers for rain, or worse, why it was raining too much. Let's start with the heat. Medieval clothing wasn't exactly optimized for airflow. Imagine working 14-hour days in heavy wool garments, hand-stitched undergarments made from rough linen, and boots that were more decorative than protective. No one was out there in breathable fabrics or cotton shorts. You cooked slowly, from the inside out, and the sun didn't care if you fainted. There was no SPF, no water breaks, no HR department to complain to. If you passed out in the field, you were expected to wake up eventually and get back to work. And if you didn't, well, they'd just call it God's will and bury you before the flies got to you. Speaking of flies, summer was a banquet for insects. The combination of livestock, open latrines, unwashed bodies, and half-buried compost heaps meant that entire villages became organic buffets for flies, fleas, and mosquitoes. And those weren't just annoying, they were dangerous. Bubonic plague, typhus, malaria, lice infestations that turned scalps into war zones. These were not rare events. These were Tuesday. Hygiene was, creative, let's say. Bathing was irregular at best and suspicious at worst. There was a persistent belief that too much bathing could weaken the body, open the pores to evil air, or make you vain. So most peasants settled for the occasional river dunk, which they usually shared with sheep, children, and someone peeing upstream. And your soap. It was made from lye and animal fat. Scrubbing yourself with it was like exfoliating with a mild acid. Now, assuming you survived the weather, the bugs, and the soap, your next challenge was the crops. Because while you might have done everything right, planted early, weeded daily, chased away crows like a sleep-deprived scarecrow with anxiety, the crops didn't always listen. Sometimes it rained too much. Sometimes not enough. Sometimes a mysterious blight would turn your wheat into dust and your barley into sadness. You'd wake up one morning, look at your field, and realize that the only thing growing well was despair. And then the Lord Steward would show up, demanding his portion of the invisible harvest. You'd explain the blight, the worms, the weather. He'd nod solemnly, then take your last chicken anyway, because contracts didn't include clauses for act of God. Meanwhile, inside the village, summer also meant that everyone you knew was sweating in close quarters. Entire families slept in single rooms. Windows, if they existed, were small and mostly decorative. Roofs trapped heat like angry thatch ovens, so people slept outside when they could, which sounds romantic until you remember the biting insects, prowling dogs, and the occasional wandering drunk who might accidentally mistake your blanket for his bed. Personal space was a theory no one had time for. And since families were large and mortality rates high, most homes had a rotating cast of toddlers, elderly relatives, pregnant cousins, and livestock who occasionally wandered in looking for shade. Now, let's talk about food. You might think summer was a time of abundance, and in theory, it was. But the harvest hadn't come yet, and last year's stores were usually long gone by midsummer. So meals were mostly porridge, flatbread, whatever, green things you could gather, and milk if the cow was still producing. Protein was a luxury. Salted meat, if you had it, was rationed like treasure. Ale was common, but not for celebration. It was safer than the water, which was usually full of bacteria or frogs, and meals were not eaten around charming tables, with embroidered cloths and pleasant conversation. No, you crouched near the fire pit, ate with your hands, and hoped no one sneezed on the communal bowl. There were also summer feasts, of course religious days, local saints' celebrations, midsummer fairs, but these were brief pauses in a marathon of exhaustion. You'd eat better for one day, maybe dance if your legs weren't shaking, then return to your duties with a hangover and a sunburn. It was the medieval equivalent of a long weekend. Pleasant, but not nearly long enough to forget how tired you were. And then, just when you thought you might get the hang of summer, the accidents started. With more daylight came more opportunity for injury. Children fell from trees. Adults sliced their hands on scythes. Someone's cousin tried to swim across the river and didn't come back. There were no ambulances, no clinics, no antiseptics. A broken leg could mean permanent lameness. An infected cut could mean death. And doctors, when available, operated on a system of guesswork, bleeding, and hope. If that didn't work, they'd call the priest. But despite all this, despite the heat, the hunger, the bugs, the wounds, summer still held a strange kind of magic. It was the season when peasants saw the stars clearly, when bonfires lit up the fields, when children ran barefoot and wild through the hedgerows, collecting stories they'd one day whisper to their own wide-eyed children. It was the season of smells, grass, smoke, manure, bread, and of sounds, like church bells echoing through the warm air, or a distant shepherd's whistle at dusk. And it was, importantly, the season of preparation, because everyone knew that summer wasn't a time to relax. It was the ticking clock before the real test. Autumn, harvest, winter. The seasons didn't offer mercy, they offered warning. Every drop of sweat now might be the difference between life and starvation in January. Every weed you pulled, every bundle of kindling you collected, every sack of grain you dried, each one was a wager against the cold, the dark, and the unknowable cruelty of the coming months. So you worked, and you worked, and you worked. You sang when you could, joked when you had breath, and prayed that your name wouldn't be added to the list of those who wouldn't make it to next spring. And as the sun set late in the evening, painting the sky orange over the hills where the Lord's manor loomed like a forgotten promise, you lay down on your straw-stuffed mattress, listened to the creaking of the wooden beams, the snoring of your siblings, the scratching of a rat behind the bread bind. You slept, not because you were at peace, but because your body no longer gave you a choice. By the time August rolled around, your body was more straw than skin, more habit than hope, and your dreams were made of sweat, cracked nails, and the hollow echo of chores you hadn't yet done. You didn't count days anymore, you measured. Life in buckets fetched, blisters popped, and sunrises survived. But now came the moment all this effort was building toward. Harvest season. This was the big one. The final exam of your agricultural existence. If summer was the boiling pot, autumn was when they tipped it over your head to see if you still had any strength left in your legs. The harvest had to be done fast, too early, and the grain wasn't ripe. Too late, and the weather might ruin it. There were no tractors, no combines, no helpful neighborhood teenagers with summer jobs. There was only you, a curved blade, a few exhausted family members, and a field that looked infinitely larger when viewed through the lens of panic. Your entire village would assemble like a miniature army, grandmothers hunched like question marks, toddlers chasing geese, and men with permanent dirt embedded in their palms, all of you, marching into the grain like soldiers into battle, not for glory but because starvation was a very persuasive motivator. Reaping was done by hand. You bent at the waist, yes again, and cut the stalks with a sickle, one tight handful at a time. If you were good, you got a rhythm going. Snatch, cut, toss, step. If you weren't, you cut your fingers, your arm, or your neighbor's knee, and someone had to fetch the priest because antiseptics hadn't been invented, and blood loss was considered an efficient method of divine communication. The work went on from dawn to dusk, with breaks only when someone fainted or the livestock escaped again. You didn't have a smartwatch, but you could tell time by the progression of your spinal pain. By mid-morning, your back screamed. By midday, your legs joined in. By evening, your soul quietly filed a request for early departure from this earthly plane. But you didn't stop, because winter was watching. Every stalk of grain cut now was one less day of hunger in February. Children were drafted in, not for symbolic reasons, but because every small pair of hands counted. They stumbled behind the adults, tying the bundles with twine made from old rope or twisted reeds, their fingers raw, their faces serious. Childhood was not a protected class, it was just the smaller, clumsier version of adulthood. If you could stand, you could work. If you could walk, you could carry. If you couldn't, well, maybe next year. After reaping came threshing. That's the part where you separate the grain from the chaff by beating it with sticks or stomping on it like you're punishing the floor for being beneath you. It was loud, messy, and took forever. If the weather turned wet, everything had to be hauled inside, where the dust would choke the air and your eyes would sting for days. But at least it was exciting, in the way that throwing your back out for the fifth time can feel slightly more dramatic than cutting plants. And once the grain was loose, it had to be winnowed, tossed in the air, so the wind could carry away the lighter husks, leaving the good stuff behind. This was done with baskets, by hand, on high ground if you had it. If not, you stood there, praying the breeze would cooperate, or that it wouldn't blow everything into the neighbor's field, which technically counted as theft if they noticed. You did all this while worrying about rats, weather, spoilage, and whether the steward would show up early to take the best share for the Lord. Spoiler, he would. His job was to appear at the worst possible moment, with an inventory list and a face like a tax audit. He didn't care if your harvest was small, if the rains had come late, or if your youngest child had a cough you were trying to ignore into non-existence. He took what was owed, sometimes more, and you smiled through your clenched teeth. Because not smiling could lead to questions, and questions could lead to punishments, and punishments could end with you spending an unpleasant night in a cage, near the manor's pig pens, and pigs are very judgmental creatures. The rest of the harvest had to be dried, stored, and guarded. Your entire caloric year now fit inside sacks, stacked in the corner of your house, or stored in the communal barn, where mold, mice, and theft were always possibilities. You counted every bushel like a miser with gold. This was your insurance, your savings, your survival plan. There was no bank, no government bailout, no phone call to make if things went badly. If your grain was ruined, you died. Quietly, slowly. In the winter, when nobody was looking anymore. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because after the harvest came something rare and precious. A festival. A celebration. A few nights of music, drinking, and dancing in the mud while pretending you weren't already mentally calculating next year's planting. This was when the priest would say something hopeful about God's bounty. Someone would roast a pig, the children would laugh without coughing, and for just a moment, you'd believe life might be slightly less awful than usual. You'd drink ale until the blisters stopped throbbing. You'd fall asleep in the grass, surrounded by the snoring of your neighbors, the crackle of a dying fire, and the scent of smoke and roast meat clinging to your one tunic. And in the morning, you'd wake up to the sound of someone vomiting behind the church and someone else arguing with the blacksmith over who stole whose goat. Normalcy resumed. With the grain secured and the last chicken accounted for, you turned your attention to firewood, mending your hut, and preparing your soul for the long, dark corridor of winter. Because now came the shift. The sun left a little earlier each night. The wind began to whisper through the thatch in a slightly more ominous tone. The animals huddled closer to the barn, and you, sitting by the hearth, your hands chapped, your knees cracked, your eyes bloodshot from months of squinting against the sun, would allow yourself one brief sigh of almost triumph. You had made it to the end of harvest. You weren't rich, you weren't safe, but you were alive, and in the Middle Ages, that counted as a win. You never really noticed when autumn ended and winter began. It wasn't like the sky sent a memo. It just sort of happened. One morning you stepped outside, and the air bit your face. The mud had gone stiff, and the trees stood around looking naked and offended. The chickens stopped laying, the sheep looked depressed, and even the wind had a crueler personality now. Winter didn't ask permission to arrive, simply took over like an uninvited uncle who smells like onions and has strong opinions about chimney smoke. You didn't celebrate the season, you endured it. Every task became twice as hard and yielded half the reward. Water had to be broken through with a stick. Firewood disappeared faster than you could chop it. You couldn't wash anything without risking hypothermia. So you just decided, collectively, as a village, to be a bit stinkier and hope God was too polite to comment. The days got shorter. The nights got longer. The cold got into your joints, and then into your thoughts, and then into your soul. You could feel your happiness calcify like lard in a wooden bowl. You stopped thinking in weeks, or even days. Instead, your mind counted the hours between meals and the distance between your bed and the hearth. You never strayed far from the fire, unless you wanted to audition for a role as a frozen corpse in the local cautionary tale. The animals were restless too. The cows got moody. The pigs plotted things in the shadows. The rats got bolder, more philosophical. They seemed to know your secrets. Sometimes you thought about throwing them the leftover crusts, just to see if they'd leave you in peace. But then you'd remember that every crumb was essential. You'd rationed everything, but the math was always cruel. If the harvest was slightly worse than average, and the steward took a slightly larger share than he claimed, and the rats got into 2 sacks before you caught them, well, suddenly your February started looking like a slow funeral. You'd stretch the porridge until it was more idea than substance. You'd reuse bread until it was as flexible as pottery. And if all else failed, there was always stew. Glorious, ambiguous stew. A miracle of invention and desperation. No one asked what was in it. No one wanted to know. Stew was an exercise in culinary mystery, where turnips, onions, barley, moss, and something that might have once been meat all mingled in a boiling existential crisis. You ate it because it was hot and filled the space in your stomach that sadness couldn't reach. You'd gather around the pot like monks at prayer, stirring clockwise to appease whatever spirit you imagined lived at the bottom. The children wind, the elders sighed. The middle-aged muttered prophecies about spring that no one believed. This was also the season of illness. Not dramatic theatrical diseases with obvious symptoms and heroic deaths. No, you suffered from the slow, degrading kind. The wheeze that didn't go away. The cough that woke you up in the middle of the night, and then decided to stay. The ache behind your eyes that no herb or poultice could touch. Everyone got sick. Not everyone got better. The local healer did what she could. She would leave tide roots, muttered Latin. She didn't understand, but most of her cures involved praying the fever would break before your spirit did. Death was not always loud. Sometimes it crept into the house like a bored guest and just sat quietly by the hearth, waiting for someone to close their eyes a little too long. Funerals were short and practical. You couldn't afford grief in bulk. You buried them in the frozen earth if you could, dig it, or waited for a thaw if you couldn't. Either way, life went on around the hole. There were still animals to feed, roofs to patch, stew to stir. And besides, you'd probably need that spot again soon. Winter also brought together the village in ways that were half touching, half exhausting. Everyone was stuck indoors. Privacy was a joke. You slept, ate, argued, and wept inches from each other. And the sound of someone else's bad dreams became the soundtrack to your own. You played dice or told stories to pass the time, but even that got repetitive. There are only so many times you can hear about Cousin Matthew's haunted goat before the charm wears off. So mostly, you sat and thought and stared at the wall. Your mind wandered through memories like an old man in a familiar field. You remembered summers that didn't rain too much. A girl who once smiled at you near the mill pond. That time, the blacksmith dropped a horseshoe on his own foot and tried to pretend it didn't hurt. The good moments flickered like firelight, brief, warm, and always fading. You also worried, constantly, about everything. Was there enough grain? Would the thatch hold? Had your boots finally split? Would the steward come early for the spring levee? Did the priest actually like you, or just pretend? You worried the way some people breathe without effort, without end. And through it all, you listened. To the wind outside. To the creak of the beams. To the whispers of your own exhaustion. You waited for spring not because it promised joy, but because it promised variety. You were tired of being cold, tired of being still, tired of being tired. Sometimes you dreamed of a different life, a warmer place, a softer bed, a table that never emptied, but mostly, you dreamed of bread. Warm, real, chewy bread. And maybe an apple that hadn't turned to mush. And a morning where your knees didn't sound like a bag of bones being shaken by a ghost. But dreaming was dangerous too. It made the days seem longer. The key to surviving winter wasn't hope. It was numbness. Hope made you feel things. Numbness just made you do things. And that, in the end, was what winter demanded. Not emotion, not imagination, but endurance. Quiet, uncelebrated, stubborn endurance. By the time the first signs of spring began to whisper their tired rumors across the fields, you weren't exactly filled with joy. You were suspicious. A slightly softer breeze. Probably just the wind catching its breath before another tantrum. A patch of green near the ditch. Likely some deceitful weed plotting to ruin your garden. The sun rose a little earlier, but it still looked groggy and disinterested. Like a candle that regretted being lit. Still, you noticed you always noticed. Not because you were hopeful. Hope was a risky business, but because your body kept score, even when your mind gave up. Your bones creaked less. Your boots squelched more. The mud was back, which meant things were thawing, which meant you might survive this year after all. Survival, in your world, was never a triumphant thing. There were no medals or feasts or songs written in your honor. No angel floated down with a scroll announcing that you had officially made it. No, survival was a quiet thing, like waking up from a bad dream and realizing it's not over. Just slightly less awful. The animals, too, began to act like the world might be worth tolerating again. The chickens squawked more enthusiastically. The sheep stood a little taller, if only because the ground no longer froze their hooves to the soil. The cows looked slightly less mournful. Even the rats became lazier, as if they knew you were watching. The steward eventually returned, his face as unreadable as ever, to count things, tax things, and make vague promises about next harvest being better. You nodded at all the appropriate moments, and tried not to resent the way he smelled faintly of salted pork and warmth. Planting season began with all the excitement of filing tax forms while being insulted by a goose. The ground was stubborn. The tools were blunt, and your muscles were still half asleep from winter's long, unmerciful nap. But you planted anyway. Not because you believed anything would grow. Belief was a luxury for poets and drunks, but because planting was what came next. That was the entire rhythm of your life. Things happened because they always had. Not because they made sense or brought joy, but because to not do them was unthinkable. You sowed the barley and prayed it wouldn't drown. You scattered the beans and hoped they wouldn't rot. You dug your fingers into the dirt and tried to forget that last year's yield had been pathetic. The village around you came back to life in that same slow, irritated way, like a man, waking up with a headache and no memory of the previous night. Children emerged from hiding, blinking at the sun, as if it were a foreign concept. Old men resumed their favorite task of sitting on things and complaining about how sitting used to be better. The blacksmith coughed less. The baker's bread stopped tasting like desperation. The priest tried to smile again, though it looked more like a grimace. Spring didn't bring joy. It brought tasks. So many tasks. You patched roofs. You mended fences. You scrubbed things that hadn't been scrubbed in 4 months, and discovered smells that science has yet to classify. You checked the barrels for spoilage, dumped what you couldn't save, and wept silently for every wasted crumb. You sheared the sheep, pretending not to notice the way they judged you. You repaired the plowshare again, and again, and again. Every job was like wrestling a tired god who didn't want to be worshipped anymore. And through it all, you told yourself the same quiet lie that every peasant told themselves: this year will be different. This year the rains will come at the right time. This year the steward won't take quite so much. This year the barley won't go moldy. This year your back won't betray you before the beans sprout. You knew it wasn't true, but you said it anyway. Because the alternative was silence, and silence had a way of creeping into your bones and reminding you that nothing ever really changed. And so the cycle turned, not with a shout but a sigh, not with music but with muddy boots and aching hands. And you went on, because going on was what people like you did. You weren't a hero. You weren't a villain. You were just a person, caught between the weather and the Lord's ledger, trying to stay alive long enough to complain about it. Spring was not a gift, it was an obligation. But it was warmer than winter, and for now, that was enough. And then came the fair, which was not really fair, in any sense of the word. It wasn't particularly just, nor was it especially joyous. But it was called a fair, and so everyone pretended. You pretended, too. That was your role. You woke up earlier than usual, which was offensive, because early was already bad enough. And you put on your least worst tunic, the one without the big mystery stain that looked suspiciously like goose blood, but might also be stew. The path to the fairgrounds was already crowded by the time you got there, and the whole place smelled like livestock, sour beer, and overly ambitious perfume. You stood there blinking, trying to remember if this was something to look forward to or something to endure. It was hard to tell anymore. At first glance, the fair seemed like a celebration of abundance, a gathering of wonders and noise and roasted meat. But beneath the surface, it was mostly just people trying to convince other people to give them things they didn't need in exchange for things they couldn't afford. The merchants came from other towns, wearing smug expressions and clothes with more colors than strictly necessary, shouting about spices, fabrics, and curiosities that definitely weren't stolen. You didn't believe half of what they said. You didn't need exotic peppercorns or boots made from eel leather. What you needed was cheaper grain and someone to explain why your axe handle always broke during planting season. But you wandered from stall to stall anyway, partly because you were curious, and partly because everyone else was. And you hated the idea of missing something, even if that something was just a jug of suspicious cider that gave you flashbacks to the one time you tried dentistry via River Rock. The livestock pens were somehow both fascinating and depressing. Goats bleated like they had urgent gossip to share. Pigs lay in mud with a confidence you almost envied. Chickens flapped in wire cages, looking like feathered regrets. There was one man selling ducks who insisted they were magical, which was clearly a lie, but you still watched him demonstrate how one of them could nod on command. It didn't actually do that, but the man was very convincing, and for a moment, you almost gave him a turnip in tribute. The entertainment, if it could be called that, involved a juggling monk, 2 men pretending to be bears, and a toothless woman who sang about a knight falling in love with a cabbage. You clapped politely. The beer tent was full by mid. It always was. You stood outside it, watching local men try to impress uninterested women with feats of belching and games involving throwing sticks at other sticks. Somewhere, someone played a lute badly enough to make the cows nervous. You noticed that the steward's guards were stationed at every corner, not watching the merchants or the entertainers, but watching people like you. The peasants, the ones who might accidentally decide they'd had enough. You hadn't, of course. You never had enough. Not food, not money, not anger. Anger took energy, and that was in short supply. Still, it was hard not to feel a flicker of something when you saw how much the steward's nephew paid for a single goblet of imported wine while your neighbor, Agnes, had to trade her only spare blanket just to buy leeks. You considered being outraged, but the feeling passed. Outrage was for people with time. You had potatoes to worry about. The highlight of the fair, if you could call it that, without being sued for false advertising, was the mummers' play. A group of grown adults who wore masks made of rags and sticks and performed a muddled version of a legend involving a dragon, a knight, a maiden, and an oddly aggressive loaf of bread. The dialogue made no sense. The props were clearly stolen. From someone's barn, the dragon was played by two men inside a very sad-looking blanket, and the maiden was played by a man named Colin, who was visibly drunk and fell off the makeshift stage twice. The crowd loved it. You loved it. Not because it was good. Absolutely wasn't. But because it was something. Something to look at. Something to distract you from the slow, grinding ache of being alive. For those 15 chaotic minutes, you weren't a peasant. You were a person who laughed. That was rare enough to feel sacred. Afterwards, you returned to the barter stalls and tried to exchange 2 turnips and a slightly chipped spoon for a handful of dried beans. You failed. The merchant smiled in that way that meant absolutely not, and you walked away pretending. You didn't care. Someone bumped into you. Someone else stepped on your foot. A child screamed. A pig escaped and ran into a woman selling candles. The candles caught fire. Nobody was surprised. You saw Father Bertwin standing near a cider stall, scowling at a man dressed like a wizard who claimed to sell healing rocks. The priest shouted about heresy. The wizard shouted about energy. Neither of them made much sense, and eventually they agreed to disagree over a shared jug of something pungent. The sun began to set, slowly and disinterestedly, casting a dull gold over the chaos. You stood there, staring at it, not because it was beautiful, but because it meant it was almost over. The fair, the noise, the strangers, the stink. Soon it would be just you again, your field, your cottage, your routine, the familiar rhythm of work, ache, sleep, repeat. You weren't sure if that made you relieved or disappointed, maybe both. You walked home with less than you came with. Your boots were caked in something that smelled like fermented duck. Your pouch was lighter, your head was buzzing, but you had laughed, once, loudly. That counted for something, maybe. And as you trudged back down the road, past the hedges and carts and bickering villagers, past the chickens who still looked offended and the sheep who still looked confused, you realized that this, all of this, was the closest thing you had to a holiday. And in some twisted, utterly peasant-like way, you were grateful, not happy, just less tired. For now. The winter arrived, not with a storm, but with a sigh. It didn't crash into your life like some dramatic bard's tale of frost giants and blizzards and battles in the snow. No, it simply settled in, like a dull cousin overstaying their welcome. One morning you woke up, and your breath fogged in your own cottage. The fire had burned out during the night, and your toes felt like they had been replaced by small, angry stones. Outside, the frost had crept over everything, claiming the thatch, the water barrels, the latrine door. The trees stood still, stripped bare, and looking faintly embarrassed, as if someone had stolen their clothes while they slept. The ground hardened into something that hated you. The mud was gone. You missed the mud. It had been horrible, but it was soft. This was worse. Every footstep now had the crunch and stubbornness of disappointment. You didn't own proper winter clothes. No one did, really. You layered whatever rags you had. 2 tunics, a bit of burlap, an old sack with holes cut for arms. You stuffed straw into your boots. You wrapped your hands in scraps of old apron. And still, you were cold. Always cold. The cold didn't just touch you, it moved in, took up residence inside your bones, settled behind your eyes, and made your joints hum like old church bells being rung with wet gloves. You kept the fire going as best you could. But firewood was expensive and trees were not technically yours, even the ones right next to your house. Cutting one down meant getting permission from the reeve, and the reeve had the personality of a blocked chimney. You didn't ask. You just stared longingly at the branches and imagined a world where you were brave enough to be hanged for stealing logs. The meals got worse, and that was impressive, considering how bad they were to begin. With the root vegetables turned bitter. The onions grew moldy. The beans refused to soften, no matter how long you boiled them. You began to understand why people put rocks in soup, not for flavor, but for hope. You chewed slowly, not out of politeness, but because your teeth hurt from the cold. Even the rats in the granary looked thinner. You wondered if they were as disappointed in your pantry as you were. On the rare day the sun came out, you walked to the field just to remind yourself it still existed. The soil was asleep. The tools rusted. The scarecrow stood stiff in the frost, still wearing the same hat you'd stolen from the miller 2 summers ago. It used to be funny. Now it just looked like the scarecrow was better dressed than you. The birds were gone. Even the crows. Especially the crows. You tried to read that as a good omen, but it mostly meant you were alone with your thoughts, and your thoughts weren't very good company. You tried singing once. It scared the sheep and made the neighbor's child cry. You stopped, instead. You listened to the creaks of the cottage walls, and the drip of melting frost, and the occasional shriek of someone slipping on the ice and landing. Hard enough to question the meaning of existence. Sundays were worse. On Sunday, you had to go to church, and that meant removing one layer of warmth and pretending your soul was more important than your toes. The church was cold, always. The stone absorbed every bit of heat, like a miser hoarding coins. Father Bertwin's sermons got louder in winter, possibly to compete with the sound of shivering. He preached about endurance and suffering and humility, all while wearing a fur-trimmed cloak donated by the manor lord's wife. You stared at the candles and tried to imagine fire that didn't flicker out after 10 minutes. You tried to imagine heaven mostly. You just imagined stew and socks. And not being awake, you helped neighbors when you could. That was the rule. Misery shared was slightly less miserable. You chopped firewood with old Tom, even though he once accused you of stealing his goat. You hadn't. The goat had simply left, like any sensible creature. You carried water for widow Enid, who had lost 2 husbands, 3 sons, and a considerable portion of her hearing. She told you the same story about her wedding night every time, and you nodded politely, even when it didn't make sense. You helped patch roofs, mend fences, untangled sheep, rethatch a henhouse that immediately collapsed again, and hold down a pig that didn't want to be held. Community was just cold teamwork. At night, you huddled near the fire with your blanket and your regrets. The blanket smelled like smoke and onions. Your regrets smelled like missed chances and leaky thatch. You stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks. You named them. One looked like a goose. Another looked like the steward's face, if he were being punched. You wondered if other people did this. Probably not. Other people had wine. You had herbal tea that tasted like boiled grass. You drank it anyway. You dreamt of summer, but even in your dreams, summer involved flies and back pain and someone shouting at you for not weeding fast enough. You couldn't win, not even in sleep. One morning you found a dead mouse in your boots. You weren't sure if it had crawled in there for warmth or to die dramatically. You gave it a proper burial behind the cottage, using a spoon as a shovel. You said a few words. The mouse probably deserved better, but then again, so did you. Everything slowed down. Time itself became sluggish. The days bled together. You forgot what your own hands looked like under the wrappings. You forgot how to laugh without coughing. You forgot why you planted so many turnips, but you kept going. You always did. That's what peasants did. They endured. Not because they were brave or noble or heroic, just because they didn't have the option not to. And somewhere, deep down, below the frost and the fatigue and the fermented root vegetables, you believed quietly, irrationally, that spring might come back. It always had. That didn't mean it always would. But you hoped, because hoping was cheaper than firewood. And it didn't need to be rationed. Then one day, when you had given up even the smallest expectations of seasonal logic, spring arrived. It didn't kick the door in. It didn't throw a festival, or sing songs, or offer you a basket of berries. No, it started the way all important things do, with something small and suspicious. A puddle. You stepped outside one morning, preparing to curse the usual frozen ground, and contemplate whether your left foot was turning into a wooden object. And there it was, a puddle, a real one, wet, shiny, slightly green, not frozen, not angry. You stared at it for a long time, uncertain whether this was a sign or a trap. You poked it with a stick. The stick did not break. This was progress. Then came the mud. You never thought you'd miss mud. Mud had always been one of your sworn enemies. It got in your shoes. It tried to pull your feet off. It smelled faintly of failure and goose droppings. But after months of ice and rocks and cold that made your skin feel like old cabbage, mud was a soft blessing. It meant movement. It meant thaw. It meant you could slip again, but now with optimism. The trees didn't burst into bloom. They sulked back to life. Slowly, like hungover aristocrats. First came the buds, then the tiniest hints of green. You checked them every day, as if you'd planted them yourself. A robin returned and made the mistake of singing near the Reeves window, who promptly threw a boot at it. It missed, thankfully. The bird stayed. So did the song. Your joints started hurting in a different way. Still pain, yes, but now it was movement pain, not freezing pain. You took it as a good sign. The sheep began producing offspring. They did this without permission and without regard for scheduling. You woke one morning to find 5 new lambs. In your shed, one of them was standing on your only decent blanket. You let it have it. The lamb was warmer than you, and arguably more deserving. Spring brought other people out of their cottages. Pale, blinking, vaguely confused, peasants emerged like moles, sniffing the air and pretending they had plans. You exchanged nods, small comments about puddles, speculation about root rot, and theories on whether this year's barley would be angry or just moody. Old Tom had lost 3 teeth over winter. He claimed it was frost. You suspected it was something involving a frozen turnip and a poor decision. Widow Enid had survived again. No one was sure how. She now carried a stick, with nails in it, supposedly to chase away evil spirits, but mostly used it to poke people who talked too loudly. She was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The manor lord finally appeared, after a long and mysterious winter absence. His cloak was lined with fur, real fur. Multiple animals had definitely perished for it. He rode through the village on a fresh horse, wearing an expression that said he had just woken from a 6-month nap in a room full of warm bread. He didn't wave. He rarely did. But he smelled faintly of perfume and indifference. The steward followed behind him, dropping announcements like he was scattering seeds. Except the only thing growing from them was obligation. There would be extra levies this season. Something about repairs to the outer wall, or a fountain, or a cousin's wedding. It didn't matter. You would pay. Because not paying led to fines, and fines led to punishments, and punishments involved public whippings, and deeply judgmental chickens. Work resumed. Reluctantly you unburied your tools. Some had rusted into strange shapes. Others had grown moss. One of them had become a temporary home for a family of snails. You apologized and evicted them. The fields needed clearing. The thatch needed replacing. The fences had collapsed in protest. You began the long, familiar process of trying to wrestle food from dirt. It was, as always, a negotiation. You planted beans, barley, some suspicious-looking peas, and a hopeful quantity of onions. The soil was still grumpy. It would take time, but at least now it didn't bite your fingers. The village slowly bloomed. Children appeared, running around with sticks and too much enthusiasm. Someone built a new chicken coop. Someone else fell in love and carved initials into a tree, which everyone agreed was wildly optimistic. The priest organized a festival too. Thank God for surviving another winter, though it mostly involved boiled cabbage, awkward dancing, and someone playing a flute badly. Still, people smiled. Teeth were missing, yes, but the smiles were real. You attended the festival. You even danced, which for you meant swaying vaguely in place and trying not to spill your turnip wine. You drank too much of it. It tasted like disappointment and regret, but it was warm. You watched the fire. You listened to someone singing an old folk song about a cow that got promoted to mayor. You laughed, out loud. This surprised you. A few people turned to look. You apologized, then laughed again. You were alive. And for a peasant, that was more than most stories promised. You didn't have wealth. You didn't have power. You didn't have new boots, or a working roof, or all of your original teeth. But you had survived another winter. And that made you feel, just for a moment, like a minor hero in a very boring epic. The world hadn't changed, but your corner of it had softened. The air no longer bit. The sun stayed a little longer each day. The puddles had dried. The scarecrow got a new hat, stolen from the miller again. And for the first time in months, you fell asleep without wearing your boots to bed. That, truly, was the greatest miracle of all. By the time midsummer rolled its sweaty, confusing body into the village, everything had become slightly too alive. The mud had dried into cracks, the sheep had multiplied like bad ideas, and even the insects seemed to be celebrating their survival. With high-pitched, screeching, and elaborate mating choreography, the sun, that traitorous ball of fire that had abandoned you all winter, now refused to leave. Hovering in the sky like an unpaid landlord and baking everything it could see, the peasants, including you, had begun to wilt. Your tunic stuck too, your back like a disappointed second skin. The only shade came from a bent tree near the dung heap, and even that smelled like someone had boiled socks in onion broth. Work had accelerated. The manor lord had declared that this year's harvest needed to be exceptionally bountiful to make up for last year's spiritual underperformance, which was a polite way of saying you hadn't grown enough turnips, and he had been forced to sell one of his horses instead of buying a sixth falcon. So now everyone was in the fields before dawn, half asleep, swinging tools that hadn't been properly sharpened since the last plague. Your hands developed new blisters in places you didn't think had skin. The barley resisted. The wheat sulked. The carrots looked offended. The potatoes refused to speak to anyone. But you persisted, partly because of pride, mostly because the steward had begun delivering motivational speeches involving fines and shackles. The fields shimmered with heat. Occasionally someone would pass out and be revived with a slap and a ladle of warm ale. One afternoon, you watched as a group of children caught a snake, named it Gregory, and entered it in the village's unofficial midsummer games, where it came in third in the fastest stick chase category. The winner was, unsurprisingly, Widow Enid, who chased every child off the green with her nail stick for making too much noise. Despite the sweat and exhaustion and terrifying sunburns, summer brought a strange kind of joy. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly noticeable. It was more like a background hum of not terrible. Food was plentiful, if repetitive. Bread, onions, and something you suspected was cabbage, but could also be leaves. The ale tasted like bread juice. The water like questionable honesty. But your belly was full. Sometimes, even the manor lord grew slightly less insufferable. He hosted a feast to celebrate something vague and important, possibly the birthday of a distant cousin, or the return of a particularly smug hunting dog. You were invited, not because he liked you, but because he needed bodies to clap. You clapped, enthusiastically. There was roast meat, actual spices, and a pie that made you suspicious of how happy you briefly felt. For one night, you felt less like a peasant, and more like a tired, well-fed animal in a decorative barn. The manor musicians played something that resembled music. The dancers kicked up dust and tripped over their own joy. Someone tried to recite poetry and was gently escorted outside before anyone cried. You met a girl, or rather, a girl sat near you and didn't move away immediately, which in your world counted as a declaration of affection. Her name was something soft and floral, like lilac or bramble. You tried to compliment her eyes and accidentally compared them to pond water. She laughed. You weren't sure if it was with you or at you, but you took it as encouragement. You spent the rest of the feast awkwardly near her, offering her bites of your pie and mispronouncing compliments. It was, in all ways, a success. Then the rain came back, not politely, not gradually. It arrived like a drunk uncle at a wedding, loud, dramatic, and smelling faintly of doom. It drenched the fields. It flooded the roads. It turned your roof into a sponge, and your bed into a regrettable soup. You tried to fix the leaks. The leaks laughed. You piled extra straw on the floor and hoped it would absorb both the moisture and your shame. It didn't. You awoke one night to the sound of frogs. Not near your house, inside it. You considered charging them rent. The village, once lively and bright, returned to its default setting, soggy and complaining. The steward appeared, demanding additional labor to fix the manor's drainage ditches, which had apparently offended the lord's favorite goose. You dug trenches in the rain, cursing both nobility and poultry. Your boots became swamp buckets. Your fingers pruned like overboiled turnips. And yet you survived. Again, you got used to the sound of constant drips. You developed a method of sleeping in a dry corner, curled like a pretzel, using a ladle as a pillow. You even resumed awkward conversations with Brambolilla, who confessed she liked your eyebrows, which felt like both a compliment and a mystery. The harvest approached, slow and sulky. The crops looked half ready, half ended. You prayed to every saint you could name, including several you might have invented: Saint Cabbage, Saint Avoid, Saint Definitely Real. The priest blessed the fields with water that looked suspiciously like wine. The steward inspected everything and declared it sufficient. You wanted to cheer, but instead nodded solemnly, like a man who'd seen to many plows and not enough shoes. The manor lord appeared once more, this time wearing a cloak so large it required a second horse. He praised the bounty. He praised the workers. He praised himself. Then he took half of everything and rode away. You watched the carts disappear. You felt the emptiness in the granary, and yet you didn't feel despair, not fully, because you still had enough to eat, enough to share, enough to trade for a new blanket, or at least a mostly dry one. The seasons turned again. The days shortened. The air cooled. The insects died off, or went silent. You lit a fire and leaned back, on a pile of hay that didn't smell entirely of goat. You had Bramble-Leela's name carved on your spoon. You still had both boots. You were ready. Winter would come again. It always did. But now, you had stories to carry you through. Especially the one about Gregory the Snake, who last you heard, had been promoted to village mascot after biting the steward's ankle and surviving. You made a mental note to bring him a beetle or two as thanks. After all, in a world this ridiculous, one must honor the real heroes, even the scaly ones. Winter, when it finally returned, did so, not with the theatrical flair of a blizzard, or the noble silence of falling snowflakes, but with the slow, creeping resignation of a poorly written apology. It just sort of arrived. One morning, the wind developed an opinion. Your breath became visible, and your fingers began to question every decision you'd made since birth. The air turned hard and judgmental, like a nun with frostbite. Everything slowed down, including time, thought, and your ability to care about anything that wasn't hot soup. The mud froze into cruel little sculptures of past mistakes. The chickens stopped laying eggs and started glaring at you with open contempt. Even the goats developed an attitude, standing perfectly still, as if daring you to milk them without a proper bribe. Your daily routine shrank to a loop of waking up cold, pretending you weren't cold, failing at that, and then trying to coax warmth out of things that had no business being warm, like your boots, or the cat, or the corner of the hearth that hadn't produced actual heat since the last festival involving accidental fire. Most conversations began with "still cold," and ended with "yes." No one had anything new to report, except new aches, and whose roof leaked less. The manor lord, safe behind his stone walls and triple fires, issued winter decrees through his steward, most of which involved ensuring he received enough pheasants and dried apples to maintain his mood. One such decree required everyone to attend a sermon in the cold chapel each Sunday, to give thanks for the blessing of endurance. You gave thanks, mostly for the fact that the priest spoke slowly and never looked anyone directly in the eye, which allowed you to drift into shallow naps during the psalms. The village held a winter feast, but no one really understood why. There was a turnip stew. There were dried pears. Someone brought a pig's head, which had clearly been overcooked by accident or revenge. You wore your best tunic, which had only 2 holes, and danced a little with Brambolilla, whose hands were as cold as your hopes, but just as soft. She laughed when you tripped over the dog. You smiled like a man who had very few things to smile about, and had memorized each one. The night ended early, as most things do when the firewood runs out. You walked her home, which in your world meant walking past her house and pretending to check on the fence posts. She thanked you with a nod, which you accepted as a marriage proposal. Back in your hut, you wrapped yourself in every scrap of cloth you owned. The cold found its way in anyway. It had maps, it knew your secrets. But you survived it, one long yawn at a time. You told yourself stories, some true, some almost true, and a few involving a heroic turnip named Albert. You waited for the snow, which never arrived properly. It flurried, then melted, then turned the world into gray slush that soaked your socks and your soul. You watched the sun rise through the smoke hole, a pale, apologetic thing that looked more like a ghost of summer than anything useful. You wondered what day it was. You wondered what year it was. You wondered what year it wasn't. No one had answers. The steward claimed it was the 5th winter since the chicken tax, which helped no one. The priest said it was the Lord's season, which also helped no one. A child guessed it was forever a clock, and that felt the most accurate. By midwinter, everything in the village had developed its own smell, including the smell of not being smelled in a while. You adapted. Your nose gave up. You focused instead on scraping lichen off stones and pretending it was seasoning. You repaired your roof with twigs, moss, and prayer. You thought about building a second sock. You wondered if socks came in pairs or just singular acts of desperation. You tried, once, to count how many days were left until spring. You stopped when you ran out of fingers and reasons. Time bent inward. Life became survival, but also something smaller, something not quite sad, not quite noble, just persistent. And in this persistent state, you found a sort of sleepy rhythm. Wake, shiver, eat, shiver more, feed the animals, avoid the goat, sit by the fire, talk to no one, talk to yourself, talk to Gregory the snake, now living semi-retired under your bench. He didn't answer, but you appreciated the company. You learned things too, like how cold air makes soup taste better, how silence can be a lullaby, how a single kind word from a girl with frost on her eyelashes can last longer in your chest than a bowl of stew. You even learned how to fall asleep, sitting up, with your chin tucked into your collar, like a potato hiding from judgment. And just when it seemed like the world might stay this way, this slow, gray, mumbling thing, something changed. You noticed it when the morning didn't bite quite as hard, when the ice on the bucket cracked instead of clinging, when a single bird, confused, no doubt chirped once, and then immediately regretted it. Spring wasn't here yet, but it had remembered you existed, and that was enough for now. Spring arrived the way a hungover uncle arrives at a wedding he wasn't invited to, late, disheveled and smelling vaguely of moss. One morning the frost simply forgot to show up. No dramatic thaw, no trumpets of green glory, just an absence. You noticed it when your boots didn't stick to the floor in the morning, and when the chickens resumed their half-hearted attempts at existence by pecking the mud like it had wronged them in a past life. A few brave shoots poked out of the earth, near the manure pile, as if to remind everyone that life insists on continuing, even when no one asked it to. The village stirred. People emerged from their huts, squinting like newborn bats, blinking into the wet sun with expressions that said, "Is it over? Is it safe?" The answer was, of course, no. But that didn't stop anyone from pretending. You went outside without your winter sack cloak for the first time in months, and though the wind still had opinions, it no longer felt like a betrayal. You stood there in the squelching mud, the kind that traps boots and aspirations, and took a breath that didn't hurt. It was almost disappointing. You had grown used to the drama. You poked the ground with a stick. It wobbled. Progress. The manor lord declared a spring rejoicing day, which mostly involved his steward yelling through a horn that everyone was expected to smile in the fields. You tried. Your face wasn't sure how. Brambolila smiled first, mostly at a puddle, and you copied it like a peasant mime with hay in his ears. It felt unnatural, but not unpleasant. The priest declared that the Lord had relented his divine chill, and was now preparing the soil for abundance. He said this while falling into a rut and having to be pulled out by the baker's boy. It was a good omen, according to no one. You began planting things, or more accurately, burying seeds, and praying they hadn't expired during the 4-month cold-induced coma. The ground was reluctant. still sticky with secrets and worms, but you persisted. The goats remained unimpressed. Gregory the snake slithered out from his hole, gave you a look that said, "Well, that was anticlimactic," and disappeared into the woodpile. You missed him instantly. Spring meant work, and work meant digging, lifting, bending, and remembering that your back was built more for storytelling than agriculture. Every task became a test of will and joints. You began to envy rocks. They didn't move, didn't labor, didn't have to explain why their turnips looked emotionally damaged. You developed a cough. Everyone did. It was the price of breathing. Again, you called it spring lungs, and that made it sound gentler than mold rot acquired from sleeping next to damp walls. A traveling monk passed through the village and said it was probably divine cleansing. You nodded and gave him your last apple. He blessed your goat. She bit him. Nature was healing. At the edge of the woods, the foxes returned, lean and curious, pausing at the chicken fence like philosophers at a buffet. You reinforced the coop using logic and desperation. One night you saw fireflies, for the first time since before the long cold. You cried quietly. No one saw, except the stars, which said nothing, as usual. A new child was born in the village. His name was Puddle. His mother claimed it was short for something nobler, but no one believed her. Life, like the weeds, had begun to reclaim the cracks. You attended a feast to celebrate the first sprouting of wheat. There was music, 2 drums, and a boy with a pan, and dancing, which looked a lot like walking in circles, while trying not to sneeze. You danced anyway. You weren't good. No one was. Bramble Leela tripped into you and called it rhythm. You offered her a turnip. She accepted it like a jewel. You felt rich. That night, your dreams returned. Not the fevered ones filled with wolves and freezing barns, but dreams with warmth and nonsense, like hugging a giant loaf of bread or floating in a pond made entirely of soup. You woke up confused, hungry, and oddly optimistic. The village elder declared it a sign that the spirits were smiling again, or at least smirking. You went back to work with something resembling purpose. The barley came up green and unsure. The cabbage plants looked brave, if slightly suspicious. You found a beetle wearing a bit of string. You called him Harold. He vanished. The manor lord issued a new tax, this time on shadows. Or perhaps it was a metaphor. The parchment was smudged. No one paid it. The steward returned with a list of grievances, most of which involved imaginary offenses and real turnips. You responded by sneezing in his direction, and he left muttering about peasant plagues. You returned to your tasks, watching the sun, counting clouds, and wondering if bees were supposed to buzz like that. You weren't sure, but you clapped anyway. One morning, you found a daisy growing from a crack in your wall. It wasn't particularly beautiful, but it was there, and it didn't charge rent. You named it Mildred. You said good morning to it. Daily, the cold was gone. The world was wet, alive, and slightly inconvenient again. You missed the silence of winter, but not its teeth. Spring had no teeth, just soggy socks, pollen, and a vague sense that something better might happen if you just stayed awake long enough to witness it. You didn't hope. Hope was dangerous. But you did start to hum, and that, in its own quiet way, was worse, or better. You weren't sure, but it was spring, and that was something. Spring arrived the way a hungover uncle arrives at a wedding he wasn't invited to, late, disheveled and smelling vaguely of moss. One morning the frost simply forgot to show up. No dramatic thaw, no trumpets of green glory. Just an absence. You noticed it when your boots didn't stick to the floor in the morning, and when the chickens resumed their half-hearted attempts at existence by pecking the mud like it had wronged them in a past life. A few brave shoots poked out of the earth, near the manure pile, as if to remind everyone that life insists on continuing, even when no one asked it to. The village stirred. People emerged from their huts, squinting like newborn bats, blinking into the wet sun with expressions that said, "Is it over? Is it safe?" The answer was, of course, no. But that didn't stop anyone from pretending. You went outside without your winter sack cloak for the first time in months, and though the wind still had opinions, it no longer felt like a betrayal. You stood there in the squelching mud, the kind that traps boots and aspirations and took a breath that didn't hurt. It was almost disappointing. You had grown used to the drama. You poked the ground with a stick. It wobbled. Progress. The manor lord declared a spring rejoicing day, which mostly involved his steward yelling through a horn that everyone was expected to smile in the fields. You tried. Your face wasn't sure how. Brambolila smiled first, mostly at a puddle, and you copied it like a peasant mime with hay in his ears. It felt unnatural, but not unpleasant. The priest declared that the Lord had relented his divine chill and was now preparing the soil for abundance. He said this while falling into a rut and having to be pulled out by the baker's boy. It was a good omen, according to no one. You began planting things, or more accurately, burying seeds and praying they hadn't expired during the 4-month cold-induced coma. The ground was reluctant, still sticky with secrets and worms, but you persisted. The goats remained unimpressed. Gregory the snake slithered out from his hole, gave you a look that said, well, that was anticlimactic, and disappeared into the woodpile. You missed him instantly. Spring meant work, and work meant digging, lifting, bending, and remembering that your back was built more for storytelling than agriculture. Every task became a test of will and joints. You began to envy rocks. They didn't move, didn't labor, didn't have to explain why their turnips looked emotionally damaged. You developed a cough. Everyone did. It was the price of breathing. Again, you called it spring lungs, and that made it sound gentler than mold rot acquired from sleeping next to damp walls. A traveling monk passed through the village and said it was probably divine cleansing. You nodded and gave him your last apple. He blessed your goat. She bit him. Nature was healing. At the edge of the woods, the foxes returned, lean and curious, pausing at the chicken fence like philosophers at a buffet. You reinforced the coop using logic and desperation. One night you saw fireflies, for the first time since before the long cold. You cried quietly. No one saw, except the stars, which said nothing, as usual. A new child was born in the village. His name was Puddle. His mother claimed it was short for something nobler, but no one believed her. Life, like the weeds, had begun to reclaim the cracks. You attended a feast to celebrate the first sprouting of wheat. There was music, 2 drums, and a boy with a pan, and dancing, which looked a lot like walking in circles, while trying not to sneeze. You danced anyway. You weren't good. No one was. Brambolila tripped into you and called it rhythm. You offered her a turnip. She accepted it like a jewel. You felt rich. That night, your dreams returned. Not the fevered ones filled with wolves and freezing barns, but dreams with warmth and nonsense, like hugging a giant loaf of bread or floating in a pond made entirely of soup. You woke up confused, hungry, and oddly optimistic. The village elder declared it a sign that the spirits were smiling again, or at least smirking. You went back to work with something resembling purpose. The barley came up green and unsure. The cabbage plants looked brave, if slightly suspicious. You found a beetle wearing a bit of string. You called him Harold. He vanished. The manor lord issued a new tax, this time on shadows. Or perhaps it was a metaphor. The parchment was smudged. No one paid it. The steward returned with a list of grievances, most of which involved imaginary offenses and real turnips. You responded by sneezing in his direction, and he left muttering about peasant plagues. You returned to your tasks, watching the sun, counting clouds, and wondering if bees were supposed to buzz like that. You weren't sure, but you clapped anyway. One morning, you found a daisy growing from a crack in your wall. It wasn't particularly beautiful, but it was there, and it didn't charge rent. You named it Mildred. You said good morning to it. Daily, the cold was gone. The world was wet, alive, and slightly inconvenient again. You missed the silence of winter, but not its teeth. Spring had no teeth, just soggy socks, pollen, and a vague sense that something better might happen if you just stayed awake long enough to witness it. You didn't hope. Hope was dangerous. But you did start to hum, and that, in its own quiet way, was worse, or better. You weren't sure, but it was spring, and that was something. You'd think, with the sun warming the fields and the goats slightly less violent than usual, that life would settle into something resembling contentment. But that would be too simple. And you, dear forgotten peasant of the 14th century, were not allowed simplicity. It was one of the universe's little jokes. Every time something started to feel pleasant, a wheel would fall off, or a pigeon would explode, or someone would remember you still owed them 3 onions and a confession. And yet, somehow, spring, WA is tolerable. Which made you deeply suspicious. You'd started waking up before the rooster. Not out of efficiency, but because you were certain something was going to happen. Nothing ever did. But you couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, just out of earshot, history was warming up its absurdities, like a juggler cracking his knuckles before launching flaming cabbages into a courtroom. Still, there were daily tasks. You fixed a fence. You repaired a pot using only spit and good intentions. You nearly finished that one poem you'd been mentally narrating about why cabbage shouldn't be legally classified as food. And most importantly, you finally retrieved your missing left shoe from the communal goose. She'd been using it as a romantic nest, but after some hard negotiations, and 3 radishes as bribe, you secured its release. The shoe, somewhat traumatized, would never be the same. You wore it anyway. The man our lord, in his eternal quest for being interesting without being useful, declared a public poetry contest. This confused the village immensely, as most of you believed poetry was either a type of disease or a very large turnip. He claimed it was to elevate the soul of the community, though you strongly suspected he just wanted to show off that he could rhyme chalice with malice while riding a horse. Still, prizes were promised, including an entire smoked trout and a piece of cloth not already pre-stained with destiny. So you entered, under a fake name, of course. Sir Quilford, Ducklington III, retired. Your poem, entitled Ode to the Spoon That Betrayed Me, was performed in a dramatic whisper while sitting cross-legged in a tree. It received mixed reviews. The children liked it. The chickens found it derivative. The manor lord, clearly confused, clapped for 6 minutes and then rode into a pond. You were awarded an honorary title of village word, wizard probationary, which came with no power but a badge shaped like a walnut. Brambolila was proud. She made you a crown of weeds and called you my lord of letters, which made your ears hot and your dignity crumble like old cheese. The badge now sits proudly in your single wooden bowl, next to a rock you're almost certain is haunted. It glows faintly when the moon is out. The baby Puddle, now able to crawl with the speed of an ambitious crab, began initiating minor rebellions. His army consisted of 2 puppies, 1 goat, and a flock of indifferent ducks. He stormed the baker's shed and redistributed the stale bread to anyone under the age of 5. The priest declared him anointed by mischief. You nodded solemnly and gave him your last pickle. He tried to eat it through his ear. Meanwhile, the local blacksmith began carving spoons with tiny smiling faces. No one asked him to. He just said it was time. Spoons had feelings too. One of them, named Reginald, became inexplicably popular. He was passed around from home to home, and fed only the finest porridges. You once tried to use him to stir soup, and the entire village gasped like you'd slapped a bishop. Reginald now lives in a shrine built of hay and mild panic. You visit occasionally to offer him compliments. Because, why not? The cows began holding mysterious meetings near the edge of the field. You were never invited. You began suspecting that they were plotting either global harmony or the end of buttons. You told no one. Some things are too dangerous to say aloud. The mayor, which was just what you called Old Hammertoe. Gregor, after he found a large stick and declared jurisdiction, instituted a festival of reasonable joy. It was like a festival, but quieter, and nothing was allowed to catch fire on purpose. There was dancing, but only at walking speed. There were songs, but only ones you could hum with your mouth full. It was, by all accounts, the most enthusiastically mild event in village history. You contributed a game called Guess What's in the Sock, which was won by Brambolila after she correctly identified it as regret and cabbage. She kissed your cheek and whispered, "You're weird. Don't stop. You promise not to." That night, as you lay in bed with one shoe on and a goose staring at you from the corner just in case, you tried to make sense of it all. Life, you realized, wasn't about grand achievements. It was about the spaces between disasters. The way people still sang after the rain. The way you could name a flower and pretend, for one perfect second, that the world listened. You drifted off imagining a future in which your name was remembered, not for battles or treaties, but for being the one who once made a spoon famous, and you were okay with that. Not everyone gets to be a legend. Some of us are just background, music. But sometimes, the background is the only thing holding the melody together. So you woke one morning to find the sky had changed its mind. It wasn't angry. It wasn't storming. It was just ... sideways. Not literally, of course. That would be absurd. No, it simply felt tilted. The clouds hung at funny angles. The birds flew as if they'd forgotten the choreography. And even the breeze stumbled a bit, as if it had recently read a confusing poem and needed to sit down. Naturally, this made you very nervous. Nothing obvious had gone wrong. The goats hadn't overthrown the shepherd. The priest hadn't declared the moon a heretic. But the air was off. And in your experience, off usually came before on. Fire. You did what any rational medieval peasant would do in such circumstances. You visited the village crone. Her name was Matilda Thrice, partly because she'd survived 3 lightning strikes, and partly because she answered to no man's calendar. Her hut smelled like vinegar and secrets. She fed you something that might have been soup and might have been mud. You didn't ask. You just sipped it slowly and told her about the sky. She nodded once, sharply, and said, "Ah, yes, it's begun." Then she fell asleep, mid-sentence. You waited an hour, then quietly left a turnip as payment and tiptoed out. The sky didn't untilt, but you felt slightly more informed, which was almost the same as actually being informed, and definitely cheaper than therapy. Back in the village, strange things began piling up like socks after a flood. People kept losing time, not days or hours, just little bits, a blink that lasted 10 minutes, a sneeze that skipped a meal. The village clock, a series of stones that shouted when the sun hit them, became unreliable. One stone began meowing, another claimed it was now King of France. You stopped asking questions. Instead, you started writing them down in a small book titled Important Questions to Ignore Later. Entry 1. Why does the well giggle at midnight? Entry 2. Who braided my beard into Morse code? Entry 3. How did Puddle the baby learn Latin? You did your best to stay grounded. Literally. You walked barefoot to remind yourself of dirt. You stared at snails and tried to absorb their calm. You hugged trees, not out of affection, but to see if they whispered secrets. Some of them did, mostly about worms. One particularly talkative birch told you to avoid the cheese merchant. You obeyed. The cheese merchant had always been too enthusiastic about curds. Meanwhile, Brambolila took up cartwheeling, not for joy, but as an emergency escape method. She said it made her feel less grabbable by fate. You joined her once. It ended with you colliding gently with a sheep named Bertrand, who forgave you after you apologized in rhyme. Bertrand was unusually literate. He now runs a book club. The town square hosted an impromptu festival of things that definitely aren't omens. Everyone brought something weird and explained why it wasn't cursed. Old Gregor unveiled a helmet that screamed when it rained. You claimed it was weather aware. Someone else showed off a potato that levitated slightly when insulted. Brambolila presented her left sock, which had been following her independently for days. The priest blessed everything twice, then asked if anyone had seen his shadow. Apparently it had quit. After the festival, the sky blinked. Just once, no one mentioned it. The silence was mutual. That night, you dreamt of fish debating philosophy in Latin while rowing a boat made of toast. You woke up certain something had changed, and you were right? The next morning, the entire village was covered in tiny paper notes. They were stuck to windows, goats, even the inside of your mouth. Each note read the same sentence. Thank you for participating. Recalibration underway. No one knew what it meant. The priest wept softly into his cider. The baker pretended it was a marketing stunt. You just sighed, peeled the note off your chin, and asked the wind if it had a spare clue. It did not. You considered going back to Matilda Thrice, but her house had vanished, replaced by a sign that read, temporarily elsewhere. Try again before never. So you didn't. You just walked. Past the confused trees, the suspicious puddles, and the fence that kept moving half an inch to the left every day. Eventually, you reached the top of a hill that hadn't existed last week. From there, you could see the village, still crooked, still blinking, still filled with stubborn people, doing their best to pretend that everything was normal. You smiled, because maybe that was normal. Not the absence of weirdness, but the choice to keep planting cabbages, even when gravity hiccups. You sat down on the hill, took a bite of something you hoped was bread, and watched as a duck attempted to file taxes. And you thought, well, at least, it's never boring. So the next morning, you wake up and realize that time has gone on strike. Not completely, of course. It's still technically ticking, in that your bread still molds, and your beard still grows in odd spirals. But something's off. Again, you get out of bed, only to discover that your right shoe is already on your foot, even though you distinctly remember leaving it under the goat. The goat, for her part, is now in the chimney. She refuses to explain. The sun, meanwhile, is rising like it forgot how, lurching up, stopping, muttering to itself, then jolting a bit higher, as if embarrassed. Bramble Leela, now a temporal integrity consultant, announces at breakfast that all clocks have entered a state of passive resistance. She holds up her pocket sundial, which now reads, no. The church bell rings at the wrong times, not just early or late, but meaningfully incorrect. It chimes mournfully at breakfast, giggles at noon, and does a soft jazz number at dusk. People begin keeping time by the moods of their chickens. Yours seems permanently stuck in mild concern, which you decide means it's about 3:40 p.m. The village priest says it's all very biblical, though he can't find the exact passage that mentions hens as horological devices. Probably an apocryphal rooster. The real trouble starts when old Gregor tries to report the issue to the king. His letter takes 3 weeks to write because the ink keeps floating off the page. When he finally sends it via the traditional method, stuffing it inside a duck and pointing the duck toward the castle, the duck circles back 5 minutes later with a note that says, "Office closed for recalibration. Try again in a different century." The villagers try to carry on. The baker now opens his shop whenever the yeast feels motivated. School is held during blue hour, defined by the precise moment the local pond turns a specific, disgruntled shade of teal. Marriages are performed whenever 2 people sneeze at the same time. You personally attend 3 weddings in a single afternoon, 2 of which involve the same man and a broom. No one minds. The broom seems kind. Eventually, the fabric of reality begins to fray politely. Nothing dramatic. No demons, no screaming trees. Just a quiet unraveling, like a tired sweater trying to take a nap. Words start slipping slightly. You ask for butter and get utterance. You go to the market for eggs and are handed existential doubt wrapped in straw. Bramble Leela suggests speaking only in haiku to prevent verbal misfires. It works for about a day, until someone tries to order soup and accidentally summons a brief thunderstorm. The priest begins fasting for divine clarity. 3 days in, he declares that time is not a straight line, but a series of confused goats running in a circle. No one argues it feels true. Then, one night, you receive a visitor. Not a person. Not really. More like a presence. It wears a hat that doesn't exist, and carries a clipboard shaped like anxiety. It introduces itself as Time's substitute manager, Tier 2. You offer it tea. It declines, but appreciates the gesture. It explains, very politely, that Time has filed for temporary leave due to chronic underappreciation and metaphysical burnout. You ask what happens now. It shrugs in 6 dimensions and says, "We muddle." And so you do. You muddle through days that come sideways and nights that hum in unfamiliar keys. You keep track of events, not by dates, but by vibes. The day of the floating cow, the afternoon of sudden beard growth, the Tuesday that felt like regret, and eventually, without realizing it, you stop needing time to behave. You stop measuring. You start living. Not in a grand sense, no heroic journeys or epic discoveries, just quietly, gently, like moss growing on forgotten statues. One day, Bramble Leela invites you to a picnic scheduled for when the wind turns hopeful. You pack a lunch and wait. When the wind finally shifts, you smile and go. At the picnic, people tell stories not of what happened, but of what almost happened. You tell your favorite, the one about the moment when everything wobbled, and no, one screamed, and instead of panic, you all decided to bake extra pies. The sky, still off kilter, listens politely. Somewhere, you're pretty sure time is watching, sipping tea in a hammock made of maybe, resting its tired limbs. You don't mind that it's gone. In fact, you hope it never rushes back, because in its absence, you found something oddly better. Not order, not certainty, but a rhythm that feels like breath, a beat that doesn't need clocks, a life measured in quiet joys and unhurried afternoons. And if that's not time well spent, you think, what is? You begin to notice, somewhere between the fifth cup of lukewarm herbal tea and your third attempt to organize spoons by personality type, that history is unraveling. Not in the dramatic way. Books or suspiciously educational plays suggest no crashing empires or flaming archives. No, this is subtler, kinder, in its own forgetful way. One morning, you wake up and can't quite recall who invented bread. You ask around. The baker shrugs. I always thought it invented me, he says, staring thoughtfully at a loaf that appears to be sweating. Later that day, the statue in the village square, some noble fellow with an aggressively pointing finger, quietly rotates 180 degrees. No one sees it move. It just faces the other way now, toward the river, as if considering a career change. His plaque, once proudly proclaiming Sir Bramblewick, inventor of local courage, now reads simply probably Dave. You suspect he likes it better. That night, Bramble Leela invites you to a forgetting feast. It's a new tradition, she explains, invented 2 weeks ago, or maybe in the future. Guests bring dishes with uncertain origins, meals remembered from dreams, snacks your grandmother swore were ancient but always came in suspiciously modern packaging. You bring a pie you're fairly sure you didn't bake. Everyone agrees it tastes like nostalgia and mild confusion. The conversation flows like melted butter down a crooked countertop. People tell stories of things they might have done, ancestors they possibly imagined, wars that sound familiar, but lack any detail beyond there were probably flags. A man named Rude Thomas insists he once won a battle against a swarm of angry librarians, but can't recall why they were angry, or why he was in the library, or whether the entire war was fought via overdue fees. No one doubts him. By the second course, language itself has grown sleepy. Words blur at the edges. Dates become shapes. Someone refers to the 14th century as the squinty one with all the mud, and no one blinks. Bramble Leela stands, raises a goblet full of something that fizzes apologetically, and proposes a toast to the parts we misremember. May they forgive us for trying. The room clinks and hums with approval. You leave the feast with a belly full of something warm, and a head full of gaps, gentle ones, like soft spots in an old quilt. Outside, the moon seems unusually round, and slightly to the left of where you remember it. A fox nods at you like an old friend, then forgets why it stopped and trots off humming. The next day, the village historian, a man who once carved every event into an enormous log, known as the history log, announces he's taking up interpretive gardening instead. Too many facts, not enough fennel, he mutters, planting an alibi beside a rose bush. When you visit the old records, you find they've rewritten themselves. The time the river flooded, now remembered as the year everyone learned to swim sideways. The Great Goat Incident, filed under cultural exchange, interspecies. The Battle of Thistlehill, apparently just a very aggressive picnic. At first, this bothers you. You try to remember the truth. You squeeze your eyes shut, grip the sides of your head, dig through the attic of your brain for solid, dusty facts. But all you find are cobwebbed maybes and a few vaguely accusatory spoons. Eventually, you stop searching. Not because truth isn't important, but because you realize memory, like soup, is best when stirred gently. On the 7th day of the month, that may or may not be October, You wake up and find your own diary blank. Not just empty, blank. Like it was never yours to begin with. You're not alarmed. You pick up your pen and write. Today I forgot, and it was lovely. Later, you walk through the village square and greet Sir, probably Dave. He's wearing a jaunty hat someone knitted over his stone head. You nod. He salutes. Neither of you remembers why, but it feels right. Brambolila passes you a folded note. It says, simply, history will return shortly. Please enjoy this intermission. And so you do. You sit on a bench carved from old rumors, sip a beverage of indeterminate flavor, and listen as the wind hums old lullabies that no one taught it. You're not quite sure what came before. You're even less sure what comes next. But for now, for this small, sideways moment, you are content to be a creature adrift in the warm soup of gentle forgetting. Somewhere behind your eyes, history sighs and closes its eyes. Just for a little while. Politics arrives not with a bang, but with a rustle, like someone trying to fold a map of Belgium in the dark. It shows up late, dressed in a mildly important-looking coat that smells faintly of ink and disapproval. No one remembers inviting it, but everyone nods politely as it clears its throat and declares, "Ladies and gentlefolk, I am here to organize things." This is met with scattered applause, and one man in the back whispering, "Didn't we try that last Tuesday?" Regardless, politics insists on holding a meeting. Chairs are gathered. Agendas are misplaced. The minutes are taken by a goose, who claims to be literate, but has suspicious handwriting. The first motion is to decide what's for lunch. The second motion is to postpone lunch until after the third motion, which is about the ethics of sandwiches. By the time the fourth motion arrives, something involving socks and representation. Most attendees are asleep, or quietly braiding each other's shoelaces under the table. Brambolila chairs the committee, mostly because no one else can hold a gavel without using it to tap out little songs. She listens patiently as a delegate from the Westfield proposes a tax on opinions, and the representative from the East Hedge counters with a referendum on whether trees should have voting rights. The tree in question, a large willow named Glenda, abstains by gently dropping a leaf on the floor and whispering, "Oh, not again." The debate heats up when the topic of leadership arises. Someone suggests a rotating council of elders. Someone else proposes a random lottery involving dice, jam, and a squirrel. Eventually, the teapot wins. Not by vote, it simply begins reciting soothing manifestos in a warm, bergamot-scented voice, and everyone agrees it has a commanding presence. They pin a ribbon on its handle and call it Chancellor Steam Whistle. Chancellor Steam Whistles. First decree is that every Thursday shall now be Opposite Hat Day, followed by an annual festival of hesitant decisions. No one is quite sure what that means, but everyone cheers anyway. The flag of the new administration is revealed to be a slightly damp scarf, with a drawing of a duck on it. Its motto, stitched in uneven thread, reads, "Probably doing our best." The citizens nod. It feels about right. Meanwhile, the former village mayor, a noble dog named Sir Wiggles, graciously retires and takes up a post as Minister of Sticks. His inaugural address, consisting of enthusiastic barking and 3 full-body twirls, receives a standing ovation. Politics, now thoroughly absorbed into local theater and jam distribution, begins to forget what it was supposed to be. Its briefcase becomes a planter. Its documents become origami cranes. Its rules soften into guidelines, and its arguments evolve into friendly debates over whether clouds should be taxed for loitering. Occasionally, an old-fashioned law rears its head, something about fence heights or the legal width of a smile. These are met with a collective shrug and the phrase, "We'll sort it out after the nap." And so governance becomes less about power and more about potluck dinners. Campaign speeches are given while juggling biscuits. Budgets are written in chalk on the side of a goat. Scandals involve someone accidentally hoarding too many acorns or mislabeling a marmalade jar as emergency sauce. No one is punished. Everyone just sighs and says, "Well, that's politics for you." You, being neither a politician nor a marmalade expert, are appointed ambassador of thoughtful pauses. Your duties include staring into the middle distance and humming when conversations get too lively. You're paid in hugs and mild weather. The longer this continues, the more the idea of politics fades into a warm background hum. Less a system, more a communal shrug. Decisions are made by consensus, or by whoever remembers first. Protests consist of lying in soft grass while composing strongly worded lullabies. Democracy, it turns out, is very effective when everyone forgets to be loud about it. One day, Brambalilla invites you to a summit. It's being held at the intersection of Memory Lane and Maybe Street, just across from the pond that sometimes pretends to be a lake. World leaders from nearby villages have gathered, most of whom are either confused cats or retired vegetables. There is an agenda, but it's been replaced by a pleasant drawing of a hill. Chancellor Steamwhistle opens the summit with a gentle hiss and says only, "Let's be kind and see what happens." And everyone nods. Because, in the sleepy kingdom of gentle governance, the laws are soft, the rules are squishy. And the greatest political scandal in recent memory involved someone accidentally legislating eternal spring. A motion was raised to fix it. It failed, not because people didn't care, but because they were too busy enjoying the sunshine. The economy, as it turns out, wasn't hiding. It had simply been running a small booth behind the old windmill, labeled "Things You Didn't Know You Needed, but Definitely Do." Inside were an assortment of glinting marbles, half-wishes, and one very enthusiastic pigeon named Nigel, who wears a little monocle despite having perfect vision. Claims to have studied at the University of Useful Barter, a place no one's heard of but which everyone politely pretends to remember. He begins by offering trades. 1 shiny button for a very sincere compliment. 2 pine cones for a memory of something you haven't done yet. And a polished pebble for the privilege of sitting on a particularly soft patch of moss. At first, people laugh. Then they begin to line up. The market is born, not with a crash, but with a cozy shuffle. Coins are deemed too noisy and easily swallowed by curious goats. So currency becomes something far more agreeable. Dried lavender bundles. Jokes that take exactly 4 seconds to tell, and little stones that feel nice in your hand. Every transaction ends with a thank you and a small curtsy. Inflation appears one morning in the form of a mischievous breeze that carries rumors of premium moss seating and limited edition soup. Prices go up slightly, then down again when everyone agrees that soup should never cost more than 2 smiles and a firm handshake. Banks form accidentally when people begin hiding their most valuable pebbles in hollow logs, and then forget where they put them. The logs, being naturally secretive, refuse to give them back, and instead demand small offerings of cheese or poetry before revealing their contents. These log banks become local legends, and children organize expeditions to find them, leaving behind trails of breadcrumbs and very polite treasure maps. Meanwhile, Nigel begins issuing something called feather bonds. These are bits of parchment tied to pigeon feathers, promising future comfort in exchange for present trust. They're wildly popular, despite nobody quite knowing how to redeem them. Some claim that if you collect 7, you receive a dream with extra clarity. Others insist they allow you to speak to mushrooms. Regardless, they're accepted in every shop, tavern, and daydream. A stock exchange is established, under a very large tree. Instead of stocks, participants trade moods, seasonal recipes, and partial secrets. Trading is up, someone says, gesturing to a squirrel dancing on a branch. The mood is bullish, another agrees, pointing to an actual bull quietly knitting in the corner. Economic forecasts are given by a retired weathervane named Dorothy, who spins only when she feels something important brewing. Her most recent report reads, "Drizzle expected." Also, optimism. There is no unemployment, because there are no official jobs. People simply do what they're best at, until someone gives them a biscuit or a blanket. One man becomes fabulously wealthy after inventing the concept of napping professionally. Another opens a wildly successful store called Nothing, in particular, which sells boxes labeled with vague emotions like a gentle sigh or the smell of memory. Counterfeiters are not punished, but invited to art shows. Their fake feathers are considered avant-garde and fetch a high price at local auctions, especially if they've been kissed by a bee. Taxes exist in the form of communal obligations. Once a year, Everyone has to contribute something lovely to the town. A song, a pie, or a particularly satisfying sneeze. The Department of Fairness reviews each offering, while sipping tea and humming approvingly. Budgets are proposed in interpretive dance, debated over long walks, and finalized during twilight picnics. Debts are forgiven if the debtor can make the creditor laugh. Fiscal policy involves planting tulips in patterns that spell hopeful messages when viewed from above. Eventually, some economists visit from the outside world. They carry charts and serious eyebrows. Nigel welcomes them with warm bread and soft chairs, then listens patiently as they explain that none of this should work. He offers them a feather, bond. They ask what it's backed by. Trust and pleasant afternoons, he replies. The economists leave in a daze, one of them muttering something about applying for residency. And so the economy continues, not booming, not crashing, but gently meandering, like a well-fed cat on a windowsill. There are no bubbles, only frothy ideas. No recessions, just moments when everyone agrees to rest more. Markets rise with the sunrise, and sleep when the stars come out. You, being someone who once traded a perfectly round stone for a hug that fixed your whole week, are promoted to chair of gentle commerce. Your duties include smiling encouragingly, approving new forms of soft currency, like lullabies and excellent soup, and occasionally overseeing the pillow reserve, where dreams are stored under lock, key, and 3 layers of quilted assurance. The longer it all goes on, the more people forget that economies were once loud, sharp, and full of stress. Here, commerce is about care. Investment means time and wealth. Wealth is counted in stories told, warmth shared, and the gentle knowledge that whatever you need, someone probably already saved one just for you. War arrives like a guest who wasn't invited, but shows up anyway, dripping rainwater onto the carpet and muttering about road closures. He's tired, honestly. His armor squeaks with every step, and the horse he rode in on looks deeply embarrassed. Everyone stares for a moment, not in fear, but in faint confusion, like when someone walks into the wrong wedding reception, but decides to stay for the cake. War clears his throat dramatically, raising a rusted sword that promptly slips from his grip and lodges itself harmlessly in a cabbage. I am War, he growls, with all the menace of a slightly annoyed librarian. I have come too, but before he can finish, a grandmotherly figure, named Mildred, interrupts him with a plate of steaming buns and a sharply critical eye. You look thin, she says, shoving a chair under him and wrapping a shawl over his shoulders, and you're tracking mud. For heaven's sake, take off those boots. War, baffled, complies. The boots are taken away and replaced with hand-knitted slippers labeled left and also left. He tries to resume his threatening speech, but someone hands him a hot drink and asks if he's allergic to walnuts. The next thing he knows, he's in a quilt circle, learning to crochet a doily shaped like an olive branch. Battle plans are requested but quickly replaced with potluck recipes. The only weapons discussed are carving knives and their ability to slice through stubborn rutabagas. There's a duel scheduled between 2 rival pie makers, but it's mostly passive-aggressive compliments and ends in a group nap. War attempts to rouse the town with a call to arms, only for someone to hand him a ukulele and ask him to accompany the evening sing along. You can lead the battle hymn, they say cheerfully. We're doing one in C major. The only uprising is the yeast in the community bread oven, which refuses to stop growing and is declared a minor deity by the children. Eventually, War gives up trying to be ominous and starts helping with garden patrol. He's surprisingly good at scaring away deer just by reading his old speeches in a gravelly voice. This land shall be soaked in, he bellows, but the deer have already bolted. His speeches are repurposed as bedtime stories for the local goats, who enjoy the dramatic cadence and frequently fall asleep halfway through sword or siege. The villagers are kind but firm. They won't let him raise the market, but he's welcome to help paint the new stall signs. We're at war with poor signage, they say. Join the resistance. So he paints. 2 turnips for joy, one reads. Another, please pet the cat, she's lonely. His sword is finally melted down and forged into bells, which are hung from bicycles, soup carts, and the hats of overconfident ducks. The bells ring out not as warnings, but as cheerful greetings. a kind of musical nod that says, "Peace lives here now. Try the jam." War's horse, once trained for stampedes, takes up gardening. It grows unusually aggressive radishes. No one knows why. As for War himself, he settles into a quiet routine. He starts writing poetry under a pen name W.A.R., mostly harmless, and teaches anger management through interpretive shadow puppets. He is asked to run for local office, which he declines politely, citing a desire to focus on inner softness. Occasionally, someone asks about his past campaigns, the sieges, the marches, the flames. He stares into the distance, considering how those stories end, usually with loss, regret, and someone missing from a place they used to sit. "It's quieter here," he finally says. "Better for the lungs." He's last seen tending the orchard, pruning with exaggerated care, humming something slow and ancient under his breath. And though he still startles at loud noises and gets tense around flags, he's become something new. Not a warrior, but a witness, a reminder. A man who once brought ruin, but now brings mulch. And in this peculiar polite town that disarms violence, with pastry and bathrobes, that's enough. The war is over, not because it was won, but because nobody showed up to fight, just knitters, bakers, and children who offered him daisies and asked why his eyebrows were always frowning. And really, who could argue with that? The king came back one cloudy afternoon, wearing his finest velvet cloak, which unfortunately smelled faintly of mothballs and misplaced expectations. He'd been gone for some time, exiled, overthrown, or perhaps just terribly distracted by a confusing pamphlet on constitutional reform. Regardless, he now returned expecting the old fanfare, trumpets blaring, peasants weeping, nobles throwing petals, and someone dramatically shouting, "Long live the king," while collapsing from patriotic fervor. What he found instead was a modest sign at the village gate that read "Welcome back. Try the soup," beneath which someone had drawn a smiley face with oddly accurate royal eyebrows. The throne, that once golden seat of majesty and unbending ceremony, now stood in the corner of the community hall, draped in knitted scarves, piled with umbrellas, and occasionally borrowed by a local grandmother who insisted it was perfect. For her back, the royal scepter had been thoroughly repurposed. It now served as the stirring stick for the communal soup cauldron, a duty performed with reverence and just a hint of mischief by a 9-year-old named Beatrice, who claimed it gave the broth kingly flavor. The crown, to the king's utter horror, was last seen on a snowman in midwinter, tilted rakishly above a carrot nose and adorned with googly eyes. No one meant any offense. It just looked better that way. The townsfolk greeted His Majesty warmly, if a little distractedly, as they went about setting up chairs for the evening's amateur theater performance, Hamlet, but everyone's a turnip. When the king cleared his throat and announced his royal intentions, declarations of tax levies, new decrees, something vaguely involving serfs, the town clerk gently patted his arm and handed him a clipboard. "We've got a rotation now," she said cheerfully. "Today's your day to feed the ducks and host the reading circle. Tomorrow you can lead Tai Chi, His Majesty, trained for decades in statecraft, warfare, and how to scowl imperiously without blinking, blinked a great deal." When he asked about the court, they showed him a picnic table with mismatched chairs, where disputes were settled over slices of pie and long passive-aggressive silences. The royal seal had been replaced by a community stamp shaped like a goose. "The goose judges us all," they said solemnly. And when he demanded an audience, a formal gathering of loyal subjects, the townspeople obliged, sitting attentively for exactly 4 minutes before asking if he'd mind speeding things up. The scone competition was starting soon. It was clear that monarchy, in its traditional sense, had been quietly misplaced somewhere between the Second Reformation and the rise of gluten-free baking. In its place stood something softer, stranger, and inexplicably more efficient. Leadership rotated weekly, based on a complex system of name draws, riddles, and competitive hopscotch. No one held power for long, and everyone brought snacks. "But where are the nobles?" the king asked. "Where are my knights?" They pointed to the local fencing club, where enthusiastic teenagers dueled with pool noodles and shouted, "Honor." every time someone tripped over their shoelaces. "We still have chivalry," they said. "It's just less stabby now." The royal treasury had been turned into a seed bank, lending not gold but beans, potatoes, and the occasional mysterious gourd. The royal decree scrolls had been repurposed into excellent origami swans, and as for court musicians, they had been replaced by a man named Gerald, with a squeeze box and a deep affection for sea shanties about emotionally fragile pirates. To his credit, the king tried to adapt. He attended village council, accidentally complimented someone's casserole into becoming the new Minister of Trade, and eventually began hosting lectures on medieval sword etiquette that were politely tolerated by the sheep in the barn loft. His robes, once embroidered with gold thread and tiny screaming lions, were replaced with flannel. His crown was returned to him during a birthday party. It had been housing a family of squirrels, and now bore a daisy chain and a sticker that said "Nice job." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the king stopped trying to rule. He started listening, helping, showing up to bake sales, and eventually learned the joy of being merely useful. He still referred to his garden tools as the royal trowel and Sir Ho of mulcher, but no one minded. He grew particularly fond of the ducks, and every now and then, as he sat by the lake tossing crumbs and humming a lullaby once sung to him by a nursemaid long since gone, he would think of all the ceremonies he'd memorized, the speeches, the parades, the uniforms, and wonder how something so loud had been replaced with something so quiet, so ordinary, so nice. He never issued another decree. Instead, he taught Beatrice how to hold a ladle like a sword, joined the monthly book club, which mostly discussed gossip, and became exceptionally good at making jam. He remained the king in name only, and no one minded, least of all him. After all, it's hard to maintain tyranny when you're thrown doubles as a coat rack. Your army is a dozen overfed ducks, and your people insist on hugging you before every council meeting. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, even kings deserve to rest. And so the revolution, which had not meant to be a revolution at all, more of a prolonged clerical misunderstanding, continued to settle into the soft corners of daily life like dust on a bookshelf. No one had the heart to disturb. Somewhere, between the old city walls and the disused gallows turned into a thriving tomato trellis, the nation wrote itself a new anthem. Or rather, it hummed it. No words, no martial drums, no brass declarations of blood and soil. Just a tune people sort of knew and sort of forgot. Sung mostly during soup stirring or while waiting for the kettle to boil. It was a pleasant melody, a bit out of key, especially when performed by the village goat, who insisted on joining in. The old patriotic verses once bellowed by generals atop wind-blasted cliffs were quietly recycled into the paper MCH piñatas used for the annual peace festival, now in its 12th consecutive year, without a single duel, scandal, or ceremonial beheading. The national holiday commemorated nothing in particular, just that one Tuesday everything felt okay. There were banners, naturally, but most of them were hand-stitched by the Quilting Guild and depicted birds, teacups, or abstract interpretations of emotional weather. The palace guards, those once intimidating sentinels, clad in chainmail and rigid disdain, had been gently repurposed into school crossing supervisors and amateur bird watchers. They still wore helmets, mostly out of habit, but now decorated with felt flowers and small handwritten reminders like, "Remember to smile," or "Feed Gerald the goose." Gerald had, by this point, ascended to local sainthood, not through miracle, but via sheer stubborn waddling and an uncanny ability to interrupt serious conversations with honking optimism. As for the nation's elite, the spy masters, saboteurs, and court assassins, they had not vanished. They had simply adapted. Take, for example, Madame Vesper. Once known as the Widow of Whispers, her presence had caused revolutions to shiver and empires to faint. She could vanish into shadow, extract secrets from stone, and dispatch treason with a flick of poisoned lace. Now, she ran Vespers, very quiet daycare. It was immensely popular. She specialized in toddler diplomacy. No tantrum survived her withering gaze. Her lullabies were rumored to induce dreams of perfect calm and slightly apologetic unicorns. She still wore black, of course. One must keep a little mystique. but now adorned with glitter and the occasional noodle necklace. Her most dangerous weapon, a color-coded nap chart enforced with military precision. The children adored her. Their parents did too, especially after she introduced conflict resolution techniques based on Cold War espionage, but adapted for sharing crayons. Not far from her establishment, the former Minister of War had become a potter. His bowls were uneven, his vases wobbled, but each piece bore the same inscription on the base, strong enough to hold peace. He sold out every week. Even the prison had been transformed. It was now a dog park. The former warden oversaw ball-throwing duties with great dignity, often referring to himself as the canine engagement officer. No one corrected him. The national currency had stabilized, mostly by being entirely abandoned in favor of a barter system that valued kindness, jokes, and especially good biscuits. The black market, once rife with secrets and forbidden silk, now trafficked exclusively in forbidden recipes, particularly a lemon tart. So powerful, it had once caused a spontaneous proposal in the middle of a town meeting. The old revolutionaries, once fierce and fiery, had mellowed into a sort of organized laziness. They still held meetings, of course. Revolutions require structure, even in peace. But now their manifestos were handwritten in cursive, and their primary agenda involved blanket drives, library expansions, and ensuring Gerald had enough bread. The minutes from their last meeting read simply, "Everyone is doing their best. Keep going. P.S. The jam was lovely, and the people, those ordinary, extraordinary people, who had once trembled under banners and bled for ideas scrawled in desperate ink, now lived slowly. They napped, they gardened. They occasionally debated politics over card games, but never raised their voices above the sound of a distant cow mooing at dusk. Children were taught not just history and arithmetic, but how to notice when someone needed help opening a jar. It was not utopia. The roads still cracked. The roofs still leaked. Occasionally, someone still tripped over Gerald. But no one vanished. In the night, no one was afraid of speaking kindly. No one locked their doors, and somewhere, in a converted watchtower strung with lanterns and socks drying in the breeze, the former national anthem composer had begun writing again. Not an anthem this time, but a lullaby for the whole country. It began like this: "Sleep. Now, brave dreamers, your swords are at rest. The battles are over, and peace fits you best." And though it was never officially adopted, everyone knew the words by heart. Of all the accidental traditions that emerged in the aftermath of the most peaceful rebellion, the world never really noticed. Perhaps the most oddly revered was the Great Pie Tribunal. It was first convened by General Thaddeus Blythe, who had once commanded 40,000 men across 6 kingdoms with a voice that could shatter the morale of even the most determined cavalry. He now spent his Thursdays presiding over what he called matters of national importance, by which he meant tasting pies, blackberry, rhubarb, treacle mutton. It mattered not what filled the crust, so long as the crust itself did not crumble under pressure. For General Blythe believed that flakiness in pastry was the only acceptable kind in government. Citizens traveled from distant provinces with offerings wrapped in checkered cloth and quiet hope. Contestants lined up outside the converted armory, now affectionately named the Crust Bastion, where a sign above the doorway read, "Let all disputes be settled with butter, not blood." The general, now in his 80s, bore his medals only on pie days, and only to pin his napkin. Beside him sat the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who had once negotiated the end of a 5-year siege with nothing but a raised eyebrow and a well-timed insult. Now, she assigned bonus points for presentation and deducted marks for soggy bottoms. The final member of the tribunal was a goat named Florence. No one remembered when she'd joined, but her palate was respected, her judgment swift, and her bleat decisive. Outside of Thursdays, diplomacy had become a national hobby, not the high-stakes, saber-rattling sort once conducted in marble halls, but the softer kind that took place over garden fences, knitting circles, and porch swings. Disagreements over property lines were settled with shared lemonade. Border disputes between neighborhoods were resolved with 3-legged races and poetry competitions. One village, which had once been famous for manufacturing caltrops, now produced handcrafted footstools and held annual apology parades, where each float represented a historical misunderstanding, and children threw confetti instead of accusations. The official legal system, overwhelmed by the sheer lack of crime, had taken up the task of codifying kindness. There were now bylaws about compliment frequency, statutes requiring neighborly waving, and a highly controversial but ultimately beloved ordinance declaring every second Tuesday to be Hug Your Neighbor Day. Violators were gently embraced and offered cookies until compliance was achieved. Even treaties were different now. The most recent international accord, signed by representatives from 9 former warring nations, stipulated the mutual recognition of shared holidays, blanket fort, neutrality zones, and the universal right to meet afternoon naps. Enforcement was carried out by a coalition of retired librarians, who maintained world peace through passive-aggressive notes and stern bookmarks. Of course, not everyone had adapted so smoothly. Some former warlords found the transition from conquest to calm disorienting. Lord Bastian von Grisel, for instance, had attempted to form a secret resistance to bring back the good old days of glory and mayhem. Unfortunately for him, the resistance meetings took place in a yoga studio, and after 3 sessions of deep breathing and God-assisted meditation, he began weeping during child's pose, and now teaches mindfulness to aggressive squirrels. His former banner, a flaming sword clenched by a skeletal hand, now hangs above a juice bar, where it has been repurposed into a chalkboard, advertising smoothie specials. Meanwhile, in the capital's old war room, once lit by grim candlelight and echoing with the clash of strategy, maps had been replaced by quilt patterns, and the long table used for planning invasions was now the central feature of the National Board Game Repository. Risk, Monopoly, and Diplomacy were banned for inciting tension. Most played a homemade game called Let's All Calm Down, which involved cooperative team-making and spontaneous group naps. Foreign visitors, initially skeptical of a nation run almost entirely on silliness and soft power, found themselves disarmed, sometimes literally, by the sheer gentleness of it all. A delegation from the Empire of Iron visited expecting resistance, but ended up staying 2 weeks to learn sourdough techniques. When they returned home, they declared a temporary ceasefire so they could reorganize their infantry into a synchronized baking team. Intelligence agencies, tasked with tracking threats and subversion, found their skills increasingly irrelevant. One former operative now served as the chief archivist of Lost Laughs, a museum dedicated to rediscovering old jokes no one remembered. Their most popular exhibit featured the punchline "It was actually the duck's idea," which made no sense, but made everyone chuckle anyway. And yet, in all this softness, nothing was forgotten. The archives still held the letters of the fallen, the broken swords, the last cries of men who never returned. But they were kept beside lullabies, beside crayon drawings of peace, beside recipes scrawled in the margins of old battle plans. The people remembered, not out of bitterness, but out of gratitude. Gratitude that somehow, miraculously, the typo that began a rebellion had ended not in fire, but in forgiveness. And every year, on the day once marked for mourning and martyrdom, the nation observed 2 full minutes of silence. Not for loss, but for the sound of what they'd gained. And in those 2 minutes, across villages and valleys, from mountain huts to seaside hammocks, no one spoke. Not even Gerald the goose. And it was in that quiet, not in speeches or statues or anthems, that the true victory lived. So it was. Long after the papers had stopped reporting, and the world had gone back to forgetting things that didn't explode, that someone, somewhere, finally noticed. It began, as many soft awakenings do, with a letter. Not a diplomatic communique, nor a leak from some well-dressed intelligence mole, but an envelope with a pressed daisy taped to the back, addressed to whom it may concern, written in blue ink that looped like a lullaby. It was found on the desk of a minor archivist in a coastal city-state, known mostly for its lighthouses and its intolerance for nonsense. The archivist, whose job usually involved cataloging moldy shipping receipts and forgotten tax ledgers, was having a quiet afternoon when he opened the letter and read about a nation that had abolished violence by accident, about a rebellion launched by a typo, led by a parade, remembered by pies and poetry and group naps. It sounded absurd, which is how the best truths usually begin. The archivist, a man with little power but excellent penmanship, copied the letter, word for word, and sent it to a retired professor of revolutionary history who lived in a windmill. That professor, intrigued and slightly bored, sent it to her niece who taught conflict resolution through interpretive dance. The niece performed the story at a regional arts festival, where a travel blogger with 47 followers uploaded a video titled Revolution by Rhubarb. Within a week, it had 7 million views. Then came the documentaries, of course. The interviews with retired pie judges and goat whisperers. The awkward press conferences, where foreign ministers tried to explain why no one had ever noticed an entire nation replacing its standing army with choir practice. Scholars debated whether it was really a rebellion at all. Some argued it lacked the proper ingredients. No manifestos, no guillotines, no martyrs, save a pigeon who flew into a tambourine during a peace concert. Others insisted that made it the most revolutionary of them all. Tourist agencies began offering tranquility tours, promising visitors a taste of gentle governance and artisanal jam. The locals, bemused but accommodating, handed out maps hand-drawn in pencil and gave directions using references like turn left, where the air smells like cinnamon. Embassies reopened, not with grandeur, but with teacups and knitting needles and friendly arguments about marmalade texture. The ambassadors wore socks with ducks on them. The nation's anthem, rewritten by a 12-year-old harpist, consisted of 3 notes and a yawn, and somewhere along the way, history, that lumbering beast that only ever seems to notice things, too late paused, turned its heavy gaze toward this strange, silent pocket of peace, and blinked, because nothing had burned. No towers had fallen. No victory was declared from atop a rubble heap. Just a people who had, one day, mistaken the word revolt for revel, and decided not to correct themselves. A people who had gone to the streets not to scream, but to offer lemonade and ask if maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be the way they'd always been. And it had worked. Slowly, awkwardly, hilariously. But it had worked. There were, of course, those who insisted it was all a myth. A bedtime story for tired generations, desperate for proof that not every uprising needs fire. They claimed the documents were forged, the goat a hoax, the revolution nothing more than wishful folklore. And perhaps, in some ways, they were right. But the stories persisted, whispered from hammocks, hummed across knitting circles, scrawled in the margins of cookbooks and old government ledgers, passed from lips that smiled more than they shouted, and the daisy-stamped letters kept arriving. Not always answered, not always understood, but always opened, always read, because somewhere out there, in a world that still argued about borders and barked orders into microphones, people were starting to wonder, what if we made a mistake, and that mistake turned out to be the most beautiful thing we'd ever done? What if the most polite rebellion in the world wasn't a fluke, but a guide? And what if history, for once, didn't need to be rewritten in blood, just retyped carefully, quietly, and maybe, if we're lucky, with a daisy pressed between the pages?